Countess Dracula, The Making of a Monster. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivian. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note. This manuscript was written with one guiding principle: the distinction between what can be supported by evidence and what has been shaped by story must remain intact. Elizabeth Bathory's name has traveled for centuries through two parallel histories. One is the history preserved through investigation, testimony, official action, and legal consequence. The other is the history built afterward, an afterlife of rumor, print culture, Gothic fascination, and legend. These two histories overlap, but they are not the same. The first belongs to the archive. The second belongs to imagination. The title Countess Dracula reflects this tension deliberately. It acknowledges the cultural identity that later centuries placed upon Bathory, while refusing to treat that identity as established historical fact. The vampire is not presented here as evidence. It is presented as an interpretive shadow, a symbol that attached itself to the case because the case offered a powerful foundation for it: a noblewoman, a castle, accusations of harm, an uneven state response, and a conclusion that did not provide the kind of public verdict modern readers often expect. Throughout this manuscript, language has been chosen carefully. Where actions are supported by credible documentation, arrest, confinement, servant trials, executions, and death in custody, the narrative states them directly. Where events are drawn from testimony, the narrative indicates that these are allegations, claims, or reports. Where the story moves into later myth, particularly the blood-bathing motif and the most supernatural elements, it is treated as legend and discussed as such. This is not an attempt to weaken the case, nor to sensationalize it. It is an attempt to be accurate. The surviving evidence for the Bathory case is substantial, but it is not modern. Many statements were collected under early 17th century legal conditions. Witnesses spoke within a culture defined by hierarchy and fear. Some accounts were first-hand. Many were second-hand. The record is therefore both invaluable and unstable, and it cannot always support the certainty that later retellings insist upon. This manuscript does not claim more than the archive can bear. Likewise, this manuscript does not ask the reader to accept any supernatural interpretation as truth. The idea of vampirism, immortality, or ritual blood use as a confirmed act belongs to the story's cultural afterlife rather than its documented foundation. Where such ideas appear, they are framed as conjecture, metaphor, or later invention, not as proof. At the same time, legend is not treated as irrelevant. Legends grow from real cultural conditions. They reveal what people feared, what they wanted to believe, and what kinds of explanations felt necessary when the record was incomplete or when justice felt unequal. The vampire motif attached itself to Bathory's story because it offered an image capable of carrying anxieties about power, youth, predation, and the hidden violence of privilege. Whether or not those anxieties were fully justified by the historical case, they shaped how the world remembered her. The aim, then, is not to replace myth with certainty. It is to map the boundary between them and to follow the story along both paths without confusing one for the other. Finally, this manuscript should be understood for what it is: a chronological true crime narrative written with respect for victims and restraint in the face of sensational material. The archive remembers the accused more clearly than it remembers the harmed, which is one of the cruelest patterns of historical record. Where names are absent, the absence is not treated as insignificance. It is treated as part of the story, the way the powerless vanish from the record while the powerful remain visible. The story of Elizabeth Bathory endures because it is unsettling even without the supernatural. It is unsettling because it exists in a world where power could conceal harm, where testimony could be shaped by fear, where the state could act without full transparency, and where the unresolved spaces of history invited legend to grow. This manuscript does not promise certainty. It promises care. Preface. Countess Dracula, a chronicle of record, rumor, and shadow. There are names that history records, and names that history refuses to let die. Elizabeth Bathory is both. Across Europe her story has been carried for centuries, first in whispers, then in testimony, then in print. It has traveled from villages to courts, from castles to chapels, and finally into the most enduring territory of all, legend. Over time, the Countess became something more than a woman. She became a symbol. a warning, a spectacle, a monster dressed in velvet. She also became, in the popular imagination, a vampire. The title Countess Dracula does not claim a fact that cannot be proven. It names the thing the world made of her. It acknowledges that the Bathory story exists in two forms at once: the record left by investigations and testimonies, and the later tale that gathered blood, youth, and supernatural hunger as it passed from century to century. That second story is powerful, and precisely because it is powerful, it must be handled carefully. This manuscript was written with a strict purpose: to preserve the boundary between what can be demonstrated and what has been imagined. The case of Elizabeth Bathory is not simple. It sits at the intersection of power, gender, class, politics, and violence, and it arrives to modern readers already burdened by the weight of Gothic fascination. The temptation, especially when the setting is a castle and the accusations are brutal, is to write as if certainty is easy. It is not. The historical record contains a real investigation conducted under royal authority, testimonies collected in large numbers, trials that resulted in the execution of several of Bathory's servants, and the confinement of the Countess herself until her death in 1614. These elements form the spine of the documented case. Yet within the same archive lives a problem. Much of what survives is filtered through fear, hierarchy, and human incentive. Many statements were not eyewitness accounts. Some were given under pressure. Details conflict. Motives are debated. Numbers inflate in the retelling. For every assertion, there is the question that follows it: how is this known? And who benefits from it being believed? To write this story truthfully is to accept what the record can carry, and to admit what it cannot. This book follows the chronology: the woman, the household, the rumors, the investigation, the arrest, the trials, the confinement, and the long afterlife of her legend. It does not ask the reader to choose belief over evidence. It does not ask for indulgence in spectacle. Where documents support a claim, the narrative states it. Where testimony alleges an act, the narrative names it as allegation. Where later writers introduce details that do not appear in the contemporary record, including the infamous story of bloodbaths, those details are treated as later legend, with attention paid to why and when such stories emerge. And yet, it would be dishonest to pretend that legend is irrelevant. The myths that attach themselves to the Bathory case are not random ornaments. They reveal the fears and fascinations of the people who repeated them. They show what societies have long wanted to believe about powerful women, about cruelty concealed by refinement, and about violence that feels too extreme to be explained by the ordinary. For this reason, the narrative is guided by three recurring distinctions: the record, what survives in documents, proceedings, and reliably sourced historical material; the rumor, what was claimed, repeated, and circulated, whether or not it can be proven; the shadow, interpretation and conjecture, the space where cultural meaning gathers, where myth persists, and where the vampire stands not as evidence, but as a lens. The vampire will not be presented as fact. The archive does not give fangs, immortality, or the supernatural. What the archive does provide is a human story, and in that human story, the vampire motif can be understood as something else, a way people have tried to name a particular kind of fear. The question is not whether history can certify Countess Dracula. It cannot. The more unsettling question is why so many people have wanted her to be one. There is a final boundary this book will not cross. It will not fill gaps with invention. The temptation to dramatize is strongest where evidence is thinnest. Here, restraint is not a limitation, it is the only ethical method. Atmosphere will come from place, from documented detail, from the shape of events and the pressure of silence. The horror, when it is present, will be allowed to stand on what can be responsibly said. This is the truth as far as the record can reach. Where it ends, the shadows begin, and the shadows will be marked as shadows. Because if Elizabeth Bathory is a monster, she deserves to be understood as one that history created from flesh, power, and fear, not merely from a story told in the dark. Chapter 1. The castle sits above the village like a final thought that refuses to pass. From a distance, it appears as a broken crown of stone on the ridge, walls rising where the hill allows, towers cut into the sky, the shape of defensive ambition hardened into permanence. It was never built for comfort. It was built to endure siege, to watch roads, to command the valley below. Even in calm weather it carries the posture of war, narrow openings, thick masonry, a sense of inwardness. A place designed to keep bodies in and danger out. In winter, The heights would have been colder than the settlement beneath it. Wind moving across exposed stone has a particular sound, low, insistent, as if it is always searching for a gap. Snow gathers in corners where footsteps rarely go. The air in such places is thin and sharp, even the simplest tasks become deliberate. Wood creaks. Doors catch in their frames. Breath becomes visible. This is not atmosphere built for fiction. It is the ordinary reality of a fortress in the Kingdom of Hungary at the beginning of the 17th century, a world of mud roads, livestock, travel by horse or foot, and seasons that dictated what could be stored, what could be grown, and how long the sick might survive. It is also the setting in which one of Europe's most persistent criminal legends took root. Elizabeth Bathory did not begin as a monster in the public imagination. She began as a noblewoman in a society where nobility was not merely privilege, but an entire structure of law and expectation. Her name carried weight long before accusations attached themselves to it. The Bathory family was powerful, wealthy, politically significant, and interwoven with the regional authority of its time. Such families were not simply households, they were institutions. Their influence reached into counties, courts, and royal concerns. Their marriages were alliances. Their lands were strategic. Their servants were numerous. Their private lives were rarely private in the modern sense, and yet their power allowed them to keep secrets more effectively than ordinary people could ever attempt. To understand how Elizabeth Bathory became Countess Dracula in later imagination, the story must begin where history begins, not with blood but with power, not with legend, but with the daily machinery of aristocratic life. By the time the case that would later define her began to form, Bathory was a widow. Widowhood in such a context did not necessarily mean retreat. It could mean authority. It could mean wealth managed without a husband's oversight. It could mean a household directed by one will, with servants and stewards answering to a single figure. In a world where female power was often shaped by marriage, a noble widow could become a contradiction, legally protected, socially watched, and politically inconvenient. Her estates were extensive. Her household was large. Her name was not obscure. And it is one of history's uncomfortable truths that the lives of powerful people are often preserved not because of virtue, but because of consequence. In the years leading to the investigation, rumors began to collect around her household. At first they did what rumors always do, they moved through the channels where the powerless speak. Servants, villagers, families who sent daughters into service, priests who heard anxieties in confession, traders who returned from the castle with stories that gained detail with each retelling. The content of such rumors cannot be treated as fact simply because they were repeated. But the existence of the rumors is itself part of the historical reality. They formed an atmosphere around the Bathory household, an environment in which suspicion grew familiar, then normal, then expected. A pattern is often the first signal a community notices, even when it does not yet have language for crime. People may not know what happens behind stone walls, but they notice absences. Girls who do not return. Injuries explained with too much ease. A string of funerals in which the same names appear again and again, the same household, the same employer, the same closed gates. As later testimonies would describe it, the stories were not merely of harsh discipline, common in a time that accepted violence as correction, but of cruelty that crossed from punishment into something more deliberate. Accounts gathered during the investigation would speak of beatings, confinement, torture, and death. Some statements would claim bodies were disposed of quietly. Some described wounds in unsettling detail. Others spoke of young women brought into service and reduced, one by one, into silence. Much of what survives comes through testimony recorded after the fact. In such a case, every detail must be handled carefully. Witness memory is shaped by fear. Social incentives influence what is said. Power determines whose word is preserved and whose disappears. The record is not pure, it is human. And in early modern legal contexts, the line between testimony and coercion was not always clean. Still, the allegations did not remain only in village mouths. They rose high enough to become a problem of authority. Rumor alone does not bring down a noble house. But rumor combined with politics can. The Kingdom of Hungary in this period was not stable. It was shaped by shifting loyalties, religious tensions, and the constant pressure of larger powers. In such a climate, aristocratic alliances mattered. So did land. So did debt. So did the threat of scandal. When a noble family became vulnerable, Whether through genuine crime, political maneuvering, or a mixture of both, its vulnerability could be exploited. At some point, the matter reached the attention of those who did not speak in whispers. A formal investigation began under royal authority. Officials were tasked with gathering information, collecting statements, and determining whether the accusations had substance that could withstand more than gossip. One of the key figures in this process was the Palatine of Hungary, Georgi Thurzo, a high-ranking official with the authority to act in the name of the crown. Investigations of this kind were not motivated solely by compassion. The fate of servants rarely demanded high intervention unless other forces were at play. The Bathory case sat at the intersection of several interests: the management of noble scandal, the control of land and wealth, the stability of alliances, and the maintenance of order. This does not dismiss the possibility of violence. It places it in a world where truth and advantage often traveled together. Statements were taken. Names were recorded. Reports were compiled. Accounts described injuries and deaths. Some spoke from direct experience. Others relayed what they had heard. Together they formed a body of testimony large enough to justify action. On or around the end of December 1610, officials entered Cactus Castle. What they expected to find, and what they later claimed to have found, would become the foundation of a case that ends in history, with confinement and death, and begins again in legend, with blood and immortality. Chapter 2. Names behave differently in the archives than they do in ordinary life. For most people, a name is a label, useful, forgettable, easily replaced. For the aristocracy of early modern Hungary, a name could be an inheritance in its own right, heavy with memory and power. It could open doors, command loyalty, purchase silence, and summon protection. It could also attract enemies, and when it did, those enemies rarely needed to invent reasons from nothing. They needed only to find the moment when the name was most vulnerable. The Bathory family was not new money, not a peripheral line of nobility hoping for recognition. It belonged to the ruling texture of the region, a network of landholdings, titles, and alliances formed through marriage and war. In a fragmented political landscape where borders shifted and threats pressed constantly at the edges, such families became part of the state's practical machinery. They raised troops. They negotiated loyalties. They financed defense and court. In return, they were granted privileges that were not symbolic but legal: rights over land, over taxation, over the administration of local justice. To be born into such a family was to inherit influence before one's own character had a chance to speak. It meant education, languages, letters, etiquette. It meant learning early that the world was divided into categories of people whose pain mattered, and those whose pain could be absorbed as an ordinary cost of order. It meant that servants were not merely employees, but a social class existing to support the household's function, bodies arranged beneath the family like steps. Elizabeth was born into this structure, and it formed her long before any later accusation did. The record of her early life is partial, as noble records often are, more concerned with lineage, alliances, property, and reputation than with private emotion. What can be said with confidence is that she grew up in a world where violence was not rare. The 16th century in Hungary and its surrounding territories was marked by military pressure, raids, and political instability. Even noble households were not insulated from the knowledge of war. Threats did not remain theoretical. They arrived at borders, burned towns, demanded soldiers. A fortress like Cactus was not a Gothic ornament. It was a practical response to danger. In such a world, discipline was valued. Control was admired. Softness was associated with vulnerability. And within noble households, cruelty could be excused under the language of correction, justice, or necessity. None of this proves what later witnesses claimed about Elizabeth Bathory. It does, however, establish the moral climate in which such claims were able to exist without immediate disbelief. Her marriage was another piece of this machinery. For nobility, marriage was rarely a personal choice. It was an alliance of properties and obligations. Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a man who carried his own prestige and whose life was shaped by military campaigns and political duty. Together they represented something larger than individual identity, a consolidation of power through bloodline and land. The details that survive about their household life are uneven. Some later stories would portray Nadasdy as brutal, as if brutality in a husband might explain brutality in a wife. Others would romanticize him into a distant figure, removed from domestic life. Neither extreme is reliable simply because it is repeated. What remains consistent is the practical reality that a noble household required constant management. Estates involved disputes, debts, harvests, servants, repairs, and the administration of authority. If the husband was absent, the burden of governance did not disappear. It transferred. This matters because the later case against Elizabeth Bathory is inseparable from the fact that she possessed genuine power. She controlled people's lives. She controlled their wages, their food, their punishment, and often the boundaries of their movement. For servants, leaving an abusive household was not as simple as walking away. In a rigid hierarchy, leaving could mean hunger, arrest, or worse. Silence could be safer than truth. When Elizabeth became a widow, the concentration of authority tightened further. Widowhood could be a protective status. It could also be a politically exposed one. A powerful widow controlled property, and property attracted interest. It could be taxed, seized, inherited, disputed. It could be used as leverage. It could be used to settle debts. It could become a battleground in the polite language of court. This context does not absolve Elizabeth Bathory. It does not condemn her. It places her where she historically lived, at the intersection of privilege and vulnerability, protected by rank and exposed by wealth. In later retellings, particularly those shaped by Gothic imagination, her nobility becomes part of the horror. The idea of cruelty carried out in a castle is more haunting than cruelty carried out in a cottage, even though the pain is the same. The mind expects refinement to soften violence. When refinement and violence coexist, the story feels unnatural. That is one reason legends attach to the aristocracy so readily. Their lives are already theatrical to those who are excluded from them. Their homes are already symbolic. Their authority is already mythic. It is also one reason the vampire motif fits so closely to the Bathory name. Vampires in European folklore are often aristocratic by nature, beings who live above ordinary people, who feed on them without consequence, who move through generations while their victims vanish. The image of a countess consuming youth is not proof of anything supernatural, but it is a revealing metaphor for how aristocratic power was experienced by those beneath it. Before the investigation began, before testimonies were recorded, before any official entered Cactus, Elizabeth Bathory already belonged to a category of person who could inspire both reverence and fear. Her wealth meant she was protected by law. It also meant she could become a target of that same law when the Crown, or its representatives, decided it was necessary. That is the first truth of the Bathory story. It is not only a case about violence. It is a case about the uses of power. And power, once questioned, rarely returns to silence. Chapter 3. The early life of Elizabeth Bathory survives in the record the way most aristocratic childhoods do, as a series of conditions rather than a story. Lineage is clear. Estates are traced. Alliances are mapped. Names of relatives and guardians are preserved because they mattered politically. Private emotion rarely enters the archive, not because it did not exist, but because it was not considered important enough to write down. What can be said with confidence is that she was born into a world where power was inherited and fear was ordinary. The Hungary of her lifetime was not a stable kingdom at peace with itself. It was a landscape shaped by shifting borders and constant pressure from greater forces. War was not a distant event but a recurring presence, touching towns, roads, markets, and estates. Even those who lived behind stone walls could not escape the knowledge that violence was an accepted instrument of politics. A child raised in such a climate would have learned early that security was never guaranteed. Castles existed not as romantic shelters, but as practical defenses. Noble households kept arms. Noble families made plans for siege and flight. The rhythms of life were punctuated by news of conflict, raids, and alliances that changed with little warning. This was a society that understood the fragility of safety, and it shaped the values it celebrated: discipline, control, endurance, and obedience. Within the household, strict hierarchy was not merely cultural, it was legal and material. Servants were part of the estate the way livestock and fields were part of the estate. They were not equal participants in the household's life. They existed in a separate moral category, and the consequences of disobedience could be severe. Discipline was expected. Physical punishment was widely normalized. What later centuries would describe as cruelty often existed, in the 17th century, under more acceptable language: correction, order, justice. This context does not excuse later allegations against Elizabeth Bathory. It does explain why such allegations were able to develop within a system that had already blurred the line between discipline and violence. As a noble girl, Elizabeth would have received an education more extensive than most women of her era, though the details are not preserved with precision. Noble daughters were expected to manage households, oversee servants, correspond with relatives and officials, and represent their families in social settings that could have political consequences. Literacy mattered. Languages mattered. The ability to maintain a large household mattered. A noblewoman's domestic sphere was not trivial. It was a domain of influence, and sometimes, during a husband's absence, it became the primary seat of authority on an estate. Education in such a setting was not only books and letters. It was training in command. This matters because the later narratives about Elizabeth Bathory, both documentary and mythic, are often tempted to explain her as an aberration, a monster who emerged from nowhere. The record suggests something more ordinary and therefore more unsettling. She emerged from a world that normalized violence, rewarded hierarchy, and granted powerful people a degree of latitude that poorer people could barely imagine. The question is not whether her world made her capable of cruelty. Many lived in the same world without becoming the figure she later became. The question is what kind of cruelty her world permitted to go unnoticed, and for how long, before it became useful to name it. Later accounts sometimes attach sensational detail to her childhood, describing episodes of illness, fits, or early exposure to brutality as if these were the seeds of future crimes. Such stories are difficult to verify. They often appear in later retellings eager to construct a dramatic psychological origin. The temptation to manufacture an origin is strong in cases like this because it satisfies the reader's desire for explanation. But explanation is not the same as truth. The archive rarely provides a clean line from childhood to alleged violence. It provides only the conditions, and the fact that those conditions were not gentle. If there is a reliable portrait to be drawn from the period, it is this: noble children were raised to accept control as a natural state. They were trained to command and to be obeyed. They were taught to see discipline as a virtue. They were surrounded by a social order that treated the bodies of servants as both useful and disposable. This is not the portrait of a vampire. It is the portrait of a world in which certain kinds of harm could become routine. Elizabeth's adolescence moved toward its expected destination, marriage. For noble families, marriage was rarely delayed by romance. It was a transaction that consolidated property, strengthened alliances, and stabilized influence. The emotional life of the bride mattered less than the political consequences of the union. The arrangements surrounding such marriages were formal and often public, designed to announce power and legitimacy to the region. When she married Ferenc Nadesti, she entered another powerful family and another extensive household. The union placed her within a social structure where duty was constant and reputation was currency. The household was not simply a home, it was a political surface. Every servant, every steward, every visitor was a potential witness. Every story carried beyond the walls could either strengthen or damage the family's standing. And yet, paradoxically, the very size and authority of such households could protect what happened within them. A powerful home could absorb rumors without immediate consequence. It could dismiss complaints as envy. It could attribute injuries to accidents. It could silence servants with threats, payments, or the simple knowledge that servants had few places to go. It is in this contradiction, public reputation and private control, that the later Bathory case finds its first shape. Long before an official investigation began, the household already contained the conditions that would later allow stories to spread: a rigid hierarchy, normalized punishment, and a power imbalance so extreme that even genuine harm could be explained away by the social order itself. In later centuries, the image of Elizabeth Bathory would be transformed into something supernatural, as though the human world could not contain what she was believed to have done. The vampire motif feeds on that instinct. It takes violence and gives it a mythic face. It makes the horror intelligible by making it unnatural. But in the beginning, before myth, before Gothic ink, there was simply a girl born into a violent world, trained to command, protected by privilege, and surrounded by silence. And silence, in the archive, is never empty. It is only waiting to be broken. Chapter 4. Marriage, for the nobility of early modern Hungary, was rarely a private matter. It was a public joining of estates, a consolidation of influence, a decision that shaped not only bloodlines but borders. The bride and groom were important, but the union itself was the true subject, measured in land, alliances, military advantage, and future heirs. When Elizabeth Bathory married Ferenc Nadasdy, she entered a life that had already been arranged around power. The Nadasdy name carried its own authority, its own political network, its own responsibilities. Their estates were substantial. Their influence extended outward through obligations to the crown and through relationships with other families whose loyalty could be as valuable as gold. Ferenc, in particular, lived within the expectations placed upon men of his rank: service, war, duty, representation. His life was not designed for domestic stillness. It was designed for movement, between battlefields, negotiations, and courtly demands. A noble household did not pause simply because its master was absent. In fact, absence often amplified the importance of those who remained. On large estates, administration was constant. Disputes over land boundaries, the collection of rents and taxes, the management of harvests, the discipline of servants, the repair of buildings, the care of livestock, the storage of food, the control of local reputation. The household was an engine, and engines required hands. In this system, a noblewoman was not ornamental. She was trained to govern a domestic realm that could function like a small state. Her responsibilities included the management of servants, the oversight of supplies, the coordination of the household's routines, and the maintenance of social order inside the walls. She corresponded. She negotiated. She issued instructions that might be carried out in kitchens, stables, cellars, and bedrooms. And she was obeyed. The word servant suggests a narrow role to modern ears, a paid worker with an employer. In the 17th century, the reality was broader and harsher. Servants lived within the household. Their bodies belonged to the rhythm of the estate. Their work was physical, repetitive, and often unending. Their existence was regulated by permission to eat, to rest, to visit family, to speak freely. Their position carried vulnerability not only because of labor but because of proximity. They were always near, always visible, always available. The household was not only a place where people lived. It was a structure that produced obedience. Discipline, in noble estates, could be ruthless without being considered criminal. Violence existed on a spectrum that many would have accepted as normal. Punishment could be justified as correction. A servant's injury could be explained as clumsiness, defiance, accident, or deserved consequence. A servant's disappearance could be absorbed into the logic of the time: illness, flight, dismissal, shame. In a society where the poor were rarely recorded with precision, absence could vanish into the gaps of the archive with little effort. This is one of the central difficulties in any attempt to write the early Bathory story with accuracy. If later witnesses claimed extreme cruelty, the modern mind wants a moment of rupture, a moment when violence becomes so unnatural that it cannot be mistaken for discipline. Yet in the reality of the period, the line between harsh discipline and abuse was not stable. It shifted according to the status of the person being punished and the authority of the person inflicting it. A noble household could hide harm in plain sight, not through elaborate secrecy, but through the ordinary assumptions of hierarchy. The structure of the estate itself supported this. Great houses were layered spaces. There were public rooms and private rooms. There were halls meant for guests and corridors that servants moved through like veins. There were separate quarters where the work was done, away from the gaze of visitors. Kitchens, storerooms, sculleries, laundry rooms, stables, these were the heart of labor, and they often existed in the lower parts of buildings, where light was limited and smell was constant. They were worlds with their own rules, their own patterns of speaking and silence. Servants learned quickly what could be said and what could not. A complaint could end a position. A witness could become the next subject of punishment. Silence could preserve survival. The hierarchy did not need to threaten constantly, its presence was enough. At the top of that hierarchy, the noblewoman was both visible and untouchable. She moved through the household with authority that seemed natural to those around her, because the entire social order trained them to accept it. Even her anger could become a kind of weather, something felt and endured rather than questioned. In later testimonies about Bathory's household, one pattern appears again and again: young women entering service, suffering injuries, dying, disappearing, and being explained away. The accuracy of each claim is not uniform, and the record demands caution. Yet the possibility of such a pattern existing is strengthened not by the sensational, but by the ordinary. This was a world that allowed the powerful to harm the powerless without immediate consequence. Marriage did not soften this reality. It reinforced it. A married noblewoman gained status through her husband's name and connections. She also gained responsibility. Her performance as mistress of the household reflected upon the family. Disorder was not merely inconvenient, it was an insult to reputation. A servant who misbehaved did not represent only herself. She represented failure in management. She represented a crack in authority. In such a system, harshness could be praised as efficiency. Control could be admired as strength. Punishment could be framed as necessary correction. For those beneath, it could also be fear. The Nadesty household was large enough to absorb rumors without collapsing under them. That is another advantage of power. Small households are transparent, everyone knows everyone. Large households have rooms where nothing is seen, corridors where footsteps do not echo into public view. The more servants there are, the easier it is for a single servant to become lost inside the machinery. A missing girl can be replaced. A dismissed maid can be explained. An injury can be blamed on clumsiness. A death can be blamed on illness. A body can be carried out quietly under the justification of routine. To modern readers, this is the soil in which the later Bathory story becomes plausible, even before one decides what is true. The household was structured to protect authority and consume silence. Ference's absences, whether due to campaigns, responsibilities, or travel, would have left the household in the hands of those who remained. This is not an accusation, it is a reality of noble life. A wife could govern. A wife could punish. A wife could cultivate reputation, manage resources, and ensure that the estate continued to function as a disciplined entity. If something was happening within that structure, it could happen for years without the outside world seeing more than faint evidence: bruises, whispers, funerals, and the occasional disappearance. Later legends would depict the castle as a theater of cruelty, as if it were a separate realm with its own laws. The truth is less supernatural and more unsettling. The castle did not need to be haunted to be dangerous. The social order itself was already a kind of haunting, a system in which those at the bottom could suffer without creating an event large enough to break the surface of noble life. It is important, in a story like this, not to let the Gothic setting do the work of proof. Stone walls and cold corridors make readers expect horror. But the setting is not evidence. It is simply the stage upon which evidence must be tested. The narrative cannot claim what the archive cannot support. Still, the archive does support the existence of a household powerful enough to keep its internal life hidden, and a society prepared to look away. Marriage gave Elizabeth Bathory a household of that kind. It gave her servants. It gave her authority over bodies and labor. It gave her a domain where her word could be law. It placed her inside a structure that could defend her reputation even if rumors spread. It created the conditions for silence to become routine. And if later investigators were correct, if later testimonies contained truth, then the earliest warnings would not have arrived as clear accusations. They would have arrived as something smaller, easier to dismiss. A bruise explained away, an absence accounted for with a shrug, a quiet funeral, a servant who never returned home. Horror rarely announces itself as horror at the beginning. In households built like fortresses, it begins as routine. And routine is the easiest thing in the world to hide. Chapter 5. There is a particular kind of power that grows in the gaps. In noble households, absence was not unusual. Men of Ferenc Nadesty's rank were expected to serve, to travel, to negotiate, to fight. War and court both demanded movement, and a man with a title rarely belonged entirely to his own home. The household, meanwhile, remained. It continued its routines through seasons and shortages and illness. It produced food, managed labor, repaired damage, collected rents, disciplined servants, and maintained the appearance of order. The work did not diminish simply because the Lord was away. It intensified. And in that intensification, authority often shifted. In practice, the management of the estate depended on who was present. Stewards handled accounts. Bailiffs enforced local obligations. Servants performed the daily labor that kept the household alive. But above them sat the figure whose will carried weight even when she did not speak, the mistress of the household. When she was competent, the estate prospered. When she was feared, the estate obeyed. When she was both, her authority could become almost complete. This is how power becomes quiet. It no longer needs spectacle. Within the walls of a large household, everything is arranged to reduce friction. Work is divided, routines are fixed, expectations are understood. People learn who to avoid, where not to speak freely, what expressions to wear on their faces. If a household is harsh, its harshness becomes part of the air. Servants may not describe it as cruelty, they describe it as how things are. Fear does not always register as an emergency. Sometimes it becomes a habit. In later accounts connected to the Bathory case, this quiet habit of fear matters more than any single dramatic event. If mistreatment occurred, it would not have needed to happen in a single visible burst. It could occur in small, repeatable ways: an injury blamed on carelessness, a punishment justified as correction, a servant dismissed and replaced without comment, an illness that ended in a hurried burial, a young woman sent for and never seen in the village again. In such circumstances, it is not difficult to understand how rumors began. The question is how long rumors could survive before they became useful to someone with power. For much of her marriage, Elizabeth Bathory's household operated under conditions that were common among the nobility: a large staff, a strict hierarchy, and long stretches during which the Lord's presence was limited. This did not mean Elizabeth acted without constraint. Powerful families were never entirely without watchers. Reputation was always in play, and visitors arrived. Clergy came and went. Accounts were kept. Alliances were maintained. Even so, there is a difference between being observed and being supervised. Observation can be managed. Supervision requires accountability. The difference is not subtle to the people living inside it. In the absence of the master, the mistress becomes the center of gravity. She becomes the authority to which all complaints must be carried, and that fact alone can silence complaints. A servant harmed by a mistress has nowhere in the household to safely report it. A servant harmed by a servant can still be discouraged from speaking if the social structure rewards silence. And once silence becomes normal, it protects more than the original act. It protects the system that made the act possible. Over time, this kind of household develops its own internal logic. Punishment becomes expected. Obedience becomes prized. Certain people become untouchable. Certain corridors become avoided. Certain rooms become associated with dread in ways that are not written down but are remembered in bodies. The way a girl hesitates before a doorway, the way someone lowers their eyes when a name is spoken, the way a group goes quiet when footsteps approach. These are not facts of the archive. They are the likely mechanics of power within a household arranged to enforce hierarchy. They are the kinds of details that do not appear in official records because the record is made mostly by those who can write and those who have authority to preserve their version of events. This is why later testimony must be handled with precision. When statements describe cruelty, it is tempting to write as though each detail can be trusted fully. But testimony can be shaped by fear, by loyalty, by incentives, by the need to protect oneself. In a world where servants could be punished for disobedience, even truthful statements could be delivered cautiously. In a world where the crown took interest, statements could also be shaped by what witnesses believed those in power wanted to hear. The Bathory case exists in this tension, between the reality of power, which makes private harm plausible, and the reality of politics, which makes every allegation potentially useful. Absence feeds both. It feeds the ability to act unseen, and it feeds the ability to accuse when the time is right. For a noblewoman, authority was both a privilege and a risk. A capable mistress was valuable. A feared one could still be tolerated, especially if her household remained productive and her family's name remained intact. But power held by a woman could become an object of suspicion more easily than power held by a man. A harsh nobleman could be dismissed as a soldier, a disciplinarian, a man shaped by war. A harsh noblewoman could be described as unnatural. Her authority could be reinterpreted as aberration. Her household could be imagined as a theater of hidden vice. Later, this dynamic would feed the legend. It would make the vampire motif cling more readily. The image of an aristocratic woman who consumes the young is not only a sensational story, it is a story that expresses an old fear of female power when it is not contained by domestic softness. But long before she became a figure of Gothic fascination, Elizabeth Bathory was simply a woman with an estate that required management, servants who could not easily leave, and authority that could be exercised without constant oversight. The household did not require the supernatural to be dangerous. It required only the ordinary conditions of hierarchy, people with little protection serving people with near total control. In such places, the earliest signs of harm are rarely recorded as crimes. They appear as patterns, bruises explained, funerals repeated, girls who vanish into service and do not return. Each instance can be dismissed. Together they begin to form something else. Not proof, not yet, but the shape of a question that refuses to go away. And questions, once formed, do not always remain within the walls that produced them. They leak outward into villages, into churches, into markets, into the mouths of those who have nothing but words. Eventually, those words become difficult to ignore. In a world governed by rank, the smallest people are often the first to know the truth. They are also the last to be believed. Chapter 6. Rumor is a kind of smoke. It does not require a fire that can be seen from the road. It requires only heat in a hidden place, and enough people breathing it in to carry it onwards. The earliest stories connected to Elizabeth Bathory's household did not arrive as a single accusation. They arrived as fragments: a girl returning home with injuries she could not explain, a family waiting for a daughter who did not come back, a priest hearing a confession laced with fear, a traitor repeating something heard from a kitchen maid, a neighbor noticing that certain names kept appearing in funerals, and that the funerals seemed to happen too often for a household meant to be blessed by wealth. None of these fragments, on their own, are proof. In early modern life, people died regularly. Illness swept through villages. Food ran thin. Work crushed bodies. Women in service were vulnerable to exploitation, and injuries were common. A bruised servant was not unusual. A dismissed servant was not unusual. A death was not unusual. What was unusual, at least according to the way later witnesses described it, was the accumulation. The archive does not preserve the first whisper. It preserves what officials later gathered when whispers became a case. That is the nature of history. It records the moment authorities decide something matters. Everything before that moment is half seen. It survives only through later recollection, and later recollection carries its own distortions. Even so, the presence of persistent rumor matters. It suggests that stories circulated for long enough, and with enough consistency, to create a reputation that could not be contained entirely within the castle walls. A noble household could manage reputational risk in several ways. It could deny. It could intimidate. It could dismiss concerns as envy or slander. It could replace servants quickly enough that patterns were blurred. It could separate servants from their families by keeping them isolated. It could control access to those in authority. It could offer small payments. It could rely on the simple reality that poor families rarely had the standing to challenge aristocratic power. All of these were ordinary tools of an unequal society. They did not require cruelty to exist. They existed regardless. But when cruelty did exist, they could protect it. If the later accounts contained truth, then the first stories would have had to move through channels where truth often lives and dies, among servants themselves. Servants in a great house did not all share the same intimacy with the household's private life. Some worked in public areas, cleaning halls or serving food to guests. Others moved in back passages and less visible rooms, where the estate's true rhythms were kept: laundry, scullery, storage, stables. Some were closer to the mistress. Some were closer to the steward. Some were young and temporary. Some had served long enough to understand the household's rules as if they were laws of nature. Within such a system, survival depended on learning which stories could be spoken aloud and which could only be hinted at. A servant who spoke too freely risked dismissal, punishment, or worse. A servant who remained silent might keep a place, a meal, and a roof. Silence was not always loyalty. Sometimes it was simply the price of staying alive. This is how a story becomes both common knowledge and unspeakable at the same time. If servants began to talk, even quietly, it would not have been because one dramatic event forced confession. It would have been because the household's internal logic became difficult to endure. The mind can rationalize many things, but it struggles with repetition. One injury can be explained. A series of injuries becomes a pattern. One death can be attributed to illness. Multiple deaths, clustered around the same household, begin to feel like something else, even if no one dares name it. The poor rarely accuse the powerful in straight lines. They do it through stories that carry a warning inside them. At first the warning might have been small: a mother hesitating before sending her daughter into service, a girl choosing a different household, a priest advising caution, a village elder muttering that the castle was no place for the young. But once a reputation forms, it behaves like a living thing. It grows. It changes shape. It attracts embellishment. It becomes more vivid with each retelling, because vivid stories survive longer than plain ones. That is one reason the Bathory story is so difficult to write with absolute certainty. Rumor and evidence do not exist as separate streams, they braid together. The record includes testimony. The testimony includes rumor. The rumor includes fear. Fear produces exaggeration as often as it produces silence. And later centuries, hungry for Gothic narrative, selected the most vivid parts and repeated them until they became truth through familiarity. Yet it would also be irresponsible to dismiss the early stories simply because they are stories. Powerful households do not attract sustained rumors of violence without some foundation in experience, even if that foundation is later reshaped. The question then becomes less about whether rumors existed, they did, and more about why they reached a threshold where authority intervened. For a long time, the stories were local. They belonged to the villages surrounding the estates, to the roads servants traveled when they were permitted to return home, to the marketplaces where gossip moved like currency. They belonged to those who had little power and even less protection. It is possible that many people believed something dreadful was happening and still did nothing, because doing something would have required confronting a structure built to crush them. History is full of such moments, communities living beside violence they cannot stop. But the Bathory rumors did not remain purely local. They were carried upward, into spaces where the consequences of scandal mattered for reasons beyond compassion. Once a story touches the interests of nobles, it begins to behave differently. It becomes a liability. It becomes leverage. It becomes a problem that needs management, containment, or in some cases, elimination. In the later record, one of the most significant shifts occurs when allegations begin to include not only servants, but young women of higher status, a claim that, whether true or exaggerated, would have changed the political stakes dramatically. Servants could be harmed with limited consequence. Noble families could not. A story that suggested the reach of violence extended beyond peasant girls would have threatened the social order in a way that demanded response. Whether that shift was driven by truth, rumor, or political motive is one of the central tensions of the case. What remains is this: the first stories were not enough to bring the castle down. They were enough to gather and persist, to spread and thicken, to turn the household into a place that people spoke about with lowered voices. And once a place earns that kind of reputation, it becomes easier for every new injury, every new absence, every new funeral to be understood as part of the same pattern, whether or not the connection can be proven. Rumor is not evidence. But rumor is often the earliest form of warning a community has. Eventually, the warning reached someone with the power to listen. And when power listens, it rarely listens for the same reasons as the poor. Chapter 7. Silence is not the absence of sound. In great houses it is often an arrangement, maintained, enforced, rewarded, and when necessary purchased. A noble household could not function without discipline. That much is true of any large estate. Work had to be done on schedule, supplies had to be kept, animals tended, clothing laundered, fires maintained, rooms cleaned, meals prepared, letters delivered. When dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lives were arranged beneath one roof and across multiple properties, a system of obedience was not optional. It was the condition that held the structure together. Yet the same system that made an estate efficient could also make it impenetrable. Servants lived inside the household's walls and within its rules. Their days were governed by bells, routines, and orders passed down through the hierarchy. They slept in shared spaces, often cramped and cold. They rose early. They worked until fatigue became ordinary. They relied on the household not only for wages, but for food, shelter, and survival. Leaving was not always possible, and even when it was, it came with risk. A servant without a position became a servant without security. This dependence produced a particular kind of control. When a person's livelihood and safety are tied to a household, speaking out becomes dangerous in ways that are difficult to imagine from a modern distance. A complaint could cost a job. A complaint could lead to punishment. A complaint could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance, in a rigid hierarchy, was not treated gently. In such a world, silence becomes a skill. The servant class had its own internal codes, quiet ways of sharing information, warnings delivered through looks rather than words, stories told indirectly in kitchens and laundry rooms where the ears of the household were less likely to listen. But even these small freedoms had limits. Great houses were full of watchers, stewards, senior servants, guards, and those whose loyalty was shaped by reward. A household did not need to record everything to control it. It only needed to create the sense that anything might be overheard. For those beneath, the safest way to survive was often to behave as though it always was. This matters because the Bathory case, as it survives in the record, is not built upon a single public event. It is built upon accumulation, testimony collected later, rumors that persisted, a reputation that grew thick enough to attract official attention. If something harmful was happening within the household, it was able to continue because the structure surrounding it protected it. In the later accounts, servants appear in two roles at once, as victims, and as the people closest to the alleged violence. That double position is part of what makes the case so difficult. Servants were the ones most likely to see what occurred behind doors. They were also the people least able to speak about it safely. A powerful household does not need to threaten every day to be feared. It only needs to demonstrate, occasionally, that it can destroy a life without consequence. Once that is understood, the rest is done by anticipation. People police themselves. They choose caution over truth. They learn to endure. Within a castle like Cactus, this endurance would have had a physical geography. There would have been places where servants could speak and places where they could not. Corridors where footsteps were safest, corridors where footsteps were noticed. Rooms that belonged to the household's labor and rooms that belonged to its authority. A great house is a map of power. Every door, every stair, every locked storage space is part of that map. If later testimony is to be believed, there were spaces within the Bathory household that inspired particular dread. The record does not always describe these spaces with clarity, and later retellings often exaggerate them into Gothic chambers designed for torment. The truth, if it existed, would have been more mundane and therefore more horrifying, ordinary rooms used for extraordinary cruelty, precisely because ordinary rooms attract less suspicion. A cellar, a storage room, a workroom, spaces where servants already belonged, where injuries could be dismissed as accidents, and where the sounds of distress could be absorbed by stone walls and dismissed as noise. The danger in writing about such spaces is obvious. The setting invites invention. The Gothic imagination expects chains and instruments and ritual. But history is often quieter. It does not require theatrical tools. Power itself is a tool. Isolation is a tool. A locked door is a tool. The inability to refuse is a tool. Silence is a tool as well. One of the most revealing features of later testimony in cases like this is not what is said, but what is withheld. When witnesses speak carefully, when they hedge, when they rely on what they have heard rather than what they have seen, it is easy to interpret this as unreliability. Sometimes it is. But it can also be fear. It can be self-protection. It can be the habit of speaking in a way that minimizes consequences. In a world where the powerful could punish the powerless, indirect language was often safer than direct accusation. When authorities eventually began to take statements, that habit of caution would not have disappeared overnight. Even after arrest, even after the household's power was weakened, servants would have remembered what it meant to speak. And some would have remembered what it meant not to. This is one reason the Bathory archive can feel both full and incomplete at the same time. There were many testimonies, but not all were of equal weight. Some were second-hand. Some described patterns rather than events. Some repeated village stories. Some were influenced by what the witness believed investigators wanted. In the early modern legal world, questioning was not always gentle, and the desire for a coherent story could shape what was recorded. Yet even with these limitations, testimony can still contain truth. Truth does not always arrive in clean form. It often arrives in fragments, in repeated motifs, in consistency across independent voices. When many people describe similar fears, similar injuries, similar absences, the responsible historian does not treat it as proof of every detail, but does treat it as a signal that something was wrong. In the end, a household that demanded silence could continue for years without being formally challenged. The harm, if it was there, would have been absorbed into the everyday assumptions of rank. Poor families might grieve, but their grief did not automatically become an issue for the crown. Servants might vanish, but servants were easy to replace. Injuries might be visible, but they could be explained. What made the Bathory household different, what allowed it to become more than local rumor, was that silence eventually failed. Or rather, it developed cracks. A system of silence can tolerate a great deal. It can endure whispers in villages and warnings among mothers. It can endure the pity of priests and the gossip of traders. What it struggles to endure is when those whispers begin to reach people who have their own reasons to listen. That shift had not yet arrived. But the household was already preparing for it without realizing. Each rumor carried beyond the walls, each injury noticed, each absence remembered, each funeral repeated. These were the small erosions that weaken even the strongest fortress. Eventually, the story would leave the servants' corridors and enter the official world. And once that happened, silence would no longer be protection. It would become evidence. Chapter 8. A castle does not exist in isolation, no matter how strongly it appears to stand apart from the landscape. It depends on the villages below it. It depends on roads that bring food, cloth, candles, timber, and news. It depends on labor drawn from surrounding communities, boys to carry water, girls to scrub floors, men to tend horses, women to wash linen until their hands crack in winter. It depends on the church bells that regulate time and moral order alike. It depends on the ordinary world, and the ordinary world watches it in return. The local world surrounding a noble estate was not powerless in the modern political sense, but it did possess its own forms of knowledge. Villagers knew which households were generous and which were feared. They knew which lords were harsh, which stewards took bribes, which priests spoke cautiously from the pulpit, and which roads were safest after dark. They knew whose daughters went into service and how often they returned. They knew which injuries were typical and which were not. They also knew when not to speak too plainly. A noble house could punish individuals. It could not entirely prevent collective perception. When a story persists long enough, even people who avoid repeating it begin to live as though it might be true. Mothers hesitate before sending their daughters to certain estates. Young women accept positions elsewhere if they can. Local gossip thickens into warning. Traders adjust their behavior, more polite, more guarded. Even priests become careful, because spiritual authority rarely protects a village priest against the legal authority of aristocracy. In the case of Elizabeth Bathory, this local perception became an essential part of what later investigators would collect. Officials did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived in a region already humming with story. This is one reason the Bathory case cannot be understood purely as the actions of one household. It must also be understood as a relationship between that household and its surrounding communities, a relationship shaped by dependence and fear. The castle needed servants. The villages needed wages. The estate controlled land and opportunities. The villages supplied bodies. When rumors began, whether rooted in real harm, exaggeration, or a mixture, the first people to register their shape would have been those who lived closest to the estate. Not because they had access to the castle's private rooms, but because they had access to its consequences. A servant's injury might be glimpsed when she visited her family. A disappearance might be noticed when a girl failed to return on the expected day. A funeral might be observed if a body was brought down and buried with little ceremony. A priest might suspect something when he was asked to provide rites repeatedly, or when a confession carried the scent of fear. The church, in particular, occupied a complicated position. Priests were often the only literate men within reach of poor families. They recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials. They heard confessions. They were present at deathbeds. They knew which families were losing daughters. They also relied on the goodwill of powerful patrons, and the church itself was not immune to local politics. A priest might feel torn between compassion and self-preservation. A priest who angered the wrong household could find himself transferred, threatened, or cut off from support. Doctors and surgeons, where they existed, occupied a similar position. Early modern medicine did not provide the forensic certainty modern readers expect. Diagnoses were imprecise. Treatments were often ineffective. Many injuries could be explained as accidents. Bruises could be dismissed. Broken bones could be blamed on falls. Illness could be blamed on poor humors. A household of rank could offer explanations that sounded plausible enough, particularly when the victim was a servant and the household carried social authority. This uncertainty was not an obstacle to harm, it was a shield for it. In later stories, the Bathory case is sometimes written as though the region must have been blind to what was happening. It is more likely that many people suspected, feared, and discussed it, but lacked the capacity to intervene in a way that would matter. Knowledge without power is a particular kind of torture. It forces the mind to hold two truths at once, that something is wrong, and that nothing can be done. For a time, the local world did what local worlds often do under pressure. It adapted. Families made small calculations. Service in a noble house could mean food, wages, protection, and status by association. It could also mean danger. When work is scarce, danger becomes negotiable. A mother may tell herself her daughter will be safe if she behaves. A father may tell himself the stories are exaggerated. A girl may tell herself she will not be chosen for harsh attention. These are not acts of foolishness. They are acts of survival in a system that offers few alternatives. And yet, the stories persisted. Persistence alone does not prove details. But it does suggest that the household's reputation had become part of the landscape. It shaped behavior. It shaped choices. It became a shadow cast over the surrounding communities. There is another reason the local world matters. It provided the raw material for later testimony. When official investigations begin, they do not conjure facts from thin air. They gather what people already believe, what people have seen, what people have heard. In doing so, they inevitably bring both truth and distortion into the record. A witness may speak of a bruise seen with their own eyes, then add a story heard from someone else as though it carries equal weight. A witness may repeat what the village has been saying for years because it feels like common knowledge. A witness may embellish, either to satisfy investigators or to protect themselves by aligning with the dominant narrative. This is how the archive becomes a mixture: observation and gossip, fear and memory, honesty and incentive. The responsible approach is not to discard it, but to read it with discipline, to separate what is direct from what is indirect, and to remain alert to the pressures under which people spoke. In the case of Cactus, the pressures were many. There was the pressure of poverty, the pressure of social hierarchy, the pressure of law, the pressure of religion, the pressure of the crown's interest, once it arrived. And underlying all of it, the pressure of a noble household that had controlled its local world for years. It is within this context that later claims of escalating cruelty take on their historical plausibility. A large estate, a rigid hierarchy, weak medical certainty, and a local population dependent on the household for work and survival, these conditions do not create monsters. They do, however, create ideal circumstances for harm to go unchallenged. The local world, then, becomes a kind of witness in itself. Not a witness that can give sworn testimony, but a witness whose behavior reveals what it has learned. Hesitation, avoidance, gossip, quiet warnings, the slight tightening in a mother's face when the castle is mentioned, the way a trader grows careful with his words, the way a priest chooses language that cannot be punished. These are not details that appear in legal documents. They are the human atmosphere that makes legal documents possible. Long before an official entered Cactus with authority, the region surrounding it had already been living beside a story it could not confirm and could not forget. And when the time came for the crown to listen, it would not be listening only to a household. It would be listening to an entire landscape of fear. Chapter 9. In the later record, the story does not remain static. It grows darker. This is one of the most difficult movements to handle with honesty, because escalation is where myth and memory most easily begin to behave like fact. The mind prefers a narrative in which cruelty intensifies, the stakes rise, and a final threshold is crossed. History does not always offer such clean arcs. But the testimony gathered during the investigation, and the way later writers selected from it, often carries precisely that shape: an early period of harshness, followed by acts described as more deliberate and more extreme. The responsible question is not whether escalation makes a good story. It does. The question is whether the sources support it, and what kind of support they provide. Many of the accounts connected to Elizabeth Bathory's case were collected after officials began formal inquiry. They describe patterns more often than they describe dates. They speak of what was said to have happened often, frequently, for years. They recount injuries observed, punishments described, and deaths remembered. Some witnesses claim to have seen acts themselves. Others describe what they heard from servants, villagers, or relatives. The statements vary in detail and reliability, and they must be read as products of their circumstances, shaped by fear, shaped by the desire to survive, shaped by the sudden interest of authority. Even so, within that body of testimony there is a repeated suggestion that whatever was happening within the household was not confined to a single isolated incident. It was described as repetitive. And repetition has a way of creating escalation even without deliberate intent. Once a system accepts harm, it often increases simply because it can. In a noble household, Power is not only the ability to punish. It is the ability to normalize punishment until it no longer shocks. A servant who survives one beating may be beaten again. A servant injured once may be made to work until the injury worsens. A girl who is frightened learns to obey more quickly, and obedience can be interpreted as permission to demand more. This is the bleak logic of domination. The more it succeeds, the more it is used. If later witnesses were correct, then escalation may not have looked like sudden theatrical cruelty. It may have looked like a gradual shift in what the household considered acceptable. Harshness becomes routine. Routine becomes expectation. Expectation becomes entitlement. And entitlement, when applied to human bodies, becomes dangerous. Some of the testimony suggests that the alleged violence involved not only punishment but deliberate suffering, burns, wounds, exposure to cold, prolonged confinement. These details, when they appear, cannot be treated lightly. Nor can they be treated as automatically true. The archive does not grant modern certainty. It offers only what people later claimed, and the conditions under which they claimed it. What complicates matters further is that later retellings often flatten these claims into a single image: the Countess in her castle, torturing and killing in a steady ritual of blood. That is not what the record reliably provides. The record provides multiple voices, many of them inconsistent, many of them mediated, and many of them focus not on spectacle but on the everyday reality of fear. There is, however, a significant shift that appears in many discussions of the case: the suggestion that the alleged violence moved beyond peasant servant girls and began to involve young women of higher status. This claim matters because it changes the political stakes dramatically. A noble household harming servants could be overlooked for a long time. Servants were poor. Their lives were not valued equally by law or culture. Their complaints could be dismissed. Their families could be silenced. Their deaths could be explained as illness or accident. The social order was built to absorb their suffering. But if allegations touched girls from lesser nobility, even if only a small number, even if only through rumor, then the story could no longer be contained as a private matter of discipline. It became a threat to the aristocratic order itself. It became scandal. It became liability. It became something that other noble families might demand be addressed, not out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. This is one of the places where truth and political usefulness may have intersected most sharply. It is possible that the household's behavior changed. It is possible that the victims changed. It is possible that the rumors simply changed as they spread, because people were more likely to listen if the story involved girls of status. It is possible that this shift was exaggerated because it served the needs of those who wanted intervention. The archive does not allow an easy answer. It demands that the narrative remain precise. This is what was alleged. This is what can be corroborated. This is what remains uncertain. Still, the idea of escalation is not dependent solely on social status. Even within the servant class, repeated harm produces a sense of intensifying danger. A village can tolerate a harsh mistress. It struggles to tolerate repeated disappearances. Families can accept strict discipline as the price of employment. They struggle to accept deaths that seem too frequent to be natural. The longer the rumors persisted, the more they became part of the region's collective perception. Over time, even neutral details would have been pulled into the story's gravity. A girl falls ill after service, and the illness is remembered as evidence. A servant returns home bruised, and the bruises become proof. A young woman dies, and the death becomes a chapter in a broader narrative, whether or not it truly belongs there. This is what rumor does: it turns coincidence into pattern, and pattern into certainty. It is also what real violence does: it creates enough pattern that rumor no longer needs invention. It only needs recognition. By the time the investigation began in earnest, the household's reputation was no longer a loose collection of stories. It was an atmosphere. It was present in decisions made by families and priests and neighbors. It was present in the caution with which people spoke. It was present in the fact that officials could arrive and already find a region prepared to tell them what it believed. Escalation, then, may be understood in two ways at once. There may have been escalation in acts, a widening of harm, a deepening of cruelty, a shift in targets, a growing confidence born of impunity. There was certainly escalation in story, as rumors spread, as fear sharpened, as the stakes rose, as politics took interest. And when escalation reaches the level where the crown is forced to respond, the story changes again. It leaves the village and enters the state. It becomes an investigation. It becomes testimony. It becomes a matter of record. From that point onward, silence is no longer merely survival. It becomes a risk. Because once authority begins to collect stories, the stories no longer belong to the people who first whispered them. They belong to power. Chapter 10. A rumor becomes a case when it touches something that matters to power. For years, the stories surrounding Elizabeth Bathory's household existed in the local world, carried by servants, villagers, traders, priests, and families who measured their risk against their need. In such places, fear can persist without consequence because fear is not, by itself, a political problem. The suffering of servants rarely demanded intervention from the crown. The disappearance of poor girls could be absorbed into the ordinary brutalities of the time. A noble household could be harsh and still be tolerated, so long as its harshness did not threaten the wider order. But the Bathory story did not remain a private murmur forever. At a certain point, what was being said around Cactus and the other estates intersected with concerns that the state could not ignore, not necessarily because the state suddenly discovered compassion, but because the cost of ignoring it began to rise. Reputation is not merely a moral concept in aristocratic societies. It is a form of stability. A scandal strong enough to weaken a noble family can rearrange alliances. It can disrupt local administration. It can stir unrest. It can become an opportunity for rivals. It can become, in the wrong hands, a weapon. The crown's interest in a case like this would have been shaped by more than one motive at once. There is the simple need to maintain order. A noble household that becomes notorious is not only a domestic problem. It becomes a public one, because it breeds talk, and talk can become distrust. People begin to question whether the law protects them at all. They begin to whisper not only about a countess, but about the men who allow her to continue. The state does not tolerate that kind of uncertainty easily. It prefers authority to appear consistent, even when it is not. There is also the matter of aristocratic politics. Powerful families do not exist as isolated entities, they exist as nodes in a network. One family's scandal can implicate others through marriage and alliance. One family's vulnerability can encourage opportunism. In a politically unstable region, where loyalties were contested and rivalries long-standing, such vulnerabilities could be exploited quickly. And then there is the blunt reality of property. Large estates are always attractive. They can be taxed. They can be claimed. They can be inherited. They can be disputed. They can be used to settle debts. They can be taken under the language of law when the law decides the taking is justified. The more land a person controls, the more interested the state becomes in the conditions under which that land might change hands. This does not prove a conspiracy against Elizabeth Bathory. It simply acknowledges a truth that holds across history. When a wealthy person falls under suspicion, their wealth becomes part of the story whether they intend it or not. The Bathory name carried tremendous weight, but weight cuts two ways. It can protect. It can also make a fall spectacular, and spectacles are useful to states, because they demonstrate that no one is above the crown's reach. Even when a noblewoman cannot be treated like an ordinary criminal, the act of investigation itself sends a message. The crown is watching, the crown is capable of intervention, the crown retains authority. This is the point at which a local story begins to transform into an official matter. The story moves upward, into correspondence and counsel. It enters the realm of papers, orders, reports, statements, instructions. It becomes something that can be acted upon. The shift is significant because it changes the meaning of every rumor. Once the crown takes interest, even whispers become dangerous. People who once gossiped casually become wary. Those who have something to hide become defensive. Those who have been harmed may feel a sudden risky hope, the kind of hope that can draw people into speaking, even when speaking has never been safe before. It also changes the behaviour of those who gather information. Officials do not collect truth in a neutral manner. They collect what can be recorded, what can be used, what can be shaped into a coherent narrative. They gather names. They seek repeated details. They ask questions that imply the answers they want. They prioritize certain voices and ignore others. They may pressure witnesses. They may promise protection. They may threaten consequences. Even when they act in good faith, their presence distorts what people are willing to say. In a case like Bathory's, this distortion matters deeply. The testimonies that survive are not merely human memories, they are memories produced within a moment of fear and political pressure. They are accounts shaped by a sudden imbalance, a powerful noble household on one side, the crown's interest on the other, and ordinary people caught between them. This is why the crown's involvement cannot be treated as a simple endorsement of guilt. The state does not intervene only when a person is guilty. It intervenes when intervention serves its interests, when a situation becomes unmanageable, when a scandal becomes too loud, when a noble house becomes too exposed, or when a political opportunity presents itself. Sometimes these reasons coincide with real crime. Sometimes they do not. Often, they coexist. What can be said, even at this early stage, is that the state did not move against Elizabeth Bathory casually. A noblewoman of her rank could not be arrested without consequence. Her family connections, her wealth, her standing, all of these would have made intervention risky. For the crown to proceed, it needed a pathway that could be justified under the language of law and order, and it needed a figure capable of carrying out that intervention without collapsing into local backlash. That figure was Georgy Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a man whose authority placed him close to the crown itself. His involvement signals that this was not treated as a minor affair. It was a problem that required a high-ranking hand. Once Thurzo moved, the story entered a new phase. The local world, with its whispers and warnings, had carried the first shape of the tale. Now the state would attempt to turn it into something solid, a case that could be managed, explained, and resolved. And when the state enters a story, it does not merely observe it. It changes it. Chapter 11. Authority rarely arrives with drama. More often it arrives with paperwork. When Georgy Thurzo became the central figure in the investigation of Elizabeth Bathory, the shift was not only political, it was procedural. The case moved from local rumor into official action. It entered the sphere of legal language, recorded statements, and decisions made not in village kitchens but in rooms where the crown's interests were weighed against noble privilege. Thurzo was not a minor official. As Palatine of Hungary, he held one of the highest positions in the kingdom, acting as a representative of royal authority and a stabilizing force in a landscape that was often unstable. His involvement signaled that this was no longer a matter of gossip. It was a matter of state interest. In practical terms, this meant the investigation needed to become something that could justify itself. A noblewoman's reputation could be stained by rumor, but rumor alone did not provide legal grounds for arrest. To move against a figure of Bathory's status required a body of information that could be presented as evidence, or at the very least as credible suspicion. It required witnesses, documented patterns, and enough political support to withstand the backlash that would inevitably follow. Thurzo's task, then, was to gather the story in a form the state could use. The process of gathering information in early modern cases did not resemble modern policing. There was no forensic science to turn blood into certainty. There were no standardized investigative procedures designed to protect the accused from bias. Instead, investigations relied heavily on testimony, on what people said they had seen, heard, or endured. They also relied on reputation, because reputation carried weight in a society where character was often treated as proof. If a household had long been feared, that fear itself could be interpreted as evidence that something was wrong. Thurzo's movement would have involved contact with local authorities, clergy, and families. It would have required the identification of potential witnesses and the collection of statements. It would have required careful political positioning, because any action taken against Bathory would be read not only as justice, but as an assertion of power over a noble line. This is where the case begins to take on the texture of an unfolding net. The first stage of such an investigation is rarely direct confrontation. It is quiet inquiry. It is listening. It is receiving reports, asking questions, testing whether stories are consistent, and deciding which voices can be trusted. It is also the moment when rumors begin to shift, because once people understand that authority is listening, the incentives change. Some people become eager to speak, believing they are finally safe. Others become eager to speak because they sense advantage. Some become terrified and withdraw, because speaking has never been without consequence. Some align themselves with the narrative they believe will dominate, because aligning is safer than resisting. Some people tell the truth for the first time. Some tell what they think the investigator wants to hear. Thurzo's investigation, as it survives in later references, is often described as extensive, involving many testimonies. Even without pinning exact numbers too confidently, the scale itself becomes significant. It suggests sustained effort, not a single afternoon's hearing, but an extended gathering of accounts. It suggests a deliberate attempt to create a foundation strong enough to support action. Yet the existence of many testimonies does not automatically create certainty. Quantity is not the same as quality. A case can be thick with statements and still be vulnerable, if many of those statements are hearsay. In early modern communities, hearsay spreads quickly and becomes shared belief. A witness may speak with absolute conviction about something they never personally saw, because the community has been saying it for years. This creates a record that can feel compelling and still be fragile. A careful narrative must acknowledge this without turning it into an excuse to dismiss the entire archive. The task is not to prove guilt or innocence with modern confidence. The sources do not allow it. The task is to map what Thurzo did, what he collected, and what that collection reveals about the social and political world of the time. One of the most consequential parts of Thurzo's role was that he served as a bridge between local information and state action. The villagers might whisper. The priests might warn. The servants might cry quietly. But only someone like Thurzo could translate those signals into something the crown could act upon. That translation is never neutral. It carries the investigator's assumptions. It carries the crown's interests. It carries the pressure to resolve the matter in a way that protects the broader order. It also carries, potentially, the genuine horror of what witnesses described. If violence occurred, Thurzo would have been collecting not just rumors but the residue of suffering, stories shaped by fear, stories heavy with the weight of bodies that could not speak for themselves. This is where the atmosphere around the case begins to tighten. Once Thurzo moved, Elizabeth Bathory's household could not remain merely feared. It became scrutinized. Servants who might once have stayed silent might now be questioned. Local authorities who might once have looked away might now be expected to produce information. The household's internal logic, its reliance on silence, its ability to dismiss rumors as village talk, faced a new threat, the possibility that those rumors were being gathered into an official narrative. And official narratives are dangerous because they are difficult to dismantle once written. At this stage, the investigation still belonged largely to the realm of words, statements collected, rumors ordered, suspicions formalized. But words have consequences. A name written down becomes a point of vulnerability. A repeated detail becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes a justification. The movement from local fear to official action was not instantaneous. It built steadily, as investigations often do. Each statement encouraged another. Each witness suggested another name. Each rumor, once recorded, gained weight simply by being written. By the time action came, it would not arrive as a sudden eruption. It would arrive as the final step of a process that had already been underway, a process driven by the state's need to control scandal, manage power, and perhaps respond to real harm that had been tolerated too long. Thurzo's role was to make that final step possible. And once he had gathered enough to move, the story would no longer be shaped primarily by servants and villages. It would be shaped by the crown. Chapter 12. The investigation became real in the moment stories were written down. Rumor can live for years without consequence because it remains fluid. It can be denied, reshaped, dismissed, laughed at, or ignored. It belongs to mouths and memory. But once it is recorded, once a statement is taken, a name entered into a ledger, an account formalized into legal language, it begins to harden. It stops being only a story and becomes a thing with weight. Paper does not prove truth, but it does change what truth can do. In early modern legal contexts, testimony was one of the most powerful forms of evidence available. There were no cameras, no forensic labs, no reliable medical certainty. Investigators relied on what people said. The problem was that what people said was not gathered in ideal conditions. It was gathered inside a society built on hierarchy and fear. To understand the testimonies collected in Elizabeth Bathory's case, it is necessary to understand what it meant, for an ordinary person, to speak in the presence of authority. A servant speaking against a noble household was not simply describing an event. They were stepping into danger. Even if the household's power was weakened by investigation, the servant could still fear retaliation. Their family could still fear retaliation. A servant might worry that speaking would change nothing and only make them a target. A witness might speak cautiously, with indirect phrasing, or rely on hearsay not because they wished to lie, but because hearsay offered distance. It allowed them to say something without claiming personal responsibility for the claim. A witness might also speak boldly for the opposite reason, because they sense the tide turning and wish to align themselves with it. When the Crown takes interest, the safest position is often agreement with the Crown. People learn quickly when authority wants a certain kind of story. They shape their words accordingly. This is not cynicism. It is survival. Thurso's investigators collected accounts from a wide range of people: servants, villagers, local officials, and those connected to the household through work or proximity. Some statements were direct. Some were indirect. Many were complex mixtures of observation and community belief. The archive, as it survives through later references and compilations, reflects this mixture. It is thick with voices, but the voices do not speak in equal clarity. Some witnesses described injuries they had seen on bodies: bruises, cuts, burns, swelling, weakness. In a world without reliable medical explanation, these injuries were meaningful not because they were rare, but because they appeared within a pattern associated with a single household. A servant with one bruise could be dismissed as clumsy. A servant with repeated injuries, especially if multiple servants carried similar marks, became harder to explain away. Other witnesses described disappearances. A girl who entered service and did not return. A servant dismissed abruptly. A young woman who fell ill and died. The language surrounding these deaths often carried uncertainty, because uncertainty was part of early modern life. People died constantly from causes that could not be confirmed. Yet witnesses sometimes connected these deaths to the household because they believed the household caused them, or because the household's reputation had made it easier to believe. Some statements went further. They described acts of punishment and cruelty in explicit terms. These are the accounts that later retelling seize upon, and they are also the accounts that require the most careful handling. Severe allegations can be true. They can also be shaped by exaggeration, by the desire to satisfy investigators, or by the momentum of collective fear. They may include details a witness could not have known. They may be built on partial observation. They may be influenced by leading questions. In early modern investigations, questioning was not necessarily neutral. Investigators often approached witnesses with a working theory already in mind. If the Crown wanted resolution, investigators wanted coherence. Coherence is not the same as truth. A coherent story is one that fits together neatly. The human world, especially the world of fear, rarely does. Even so, there are certain patterns that become historically meaningful when they repeat across different sources. If multiple witnesses independently describe the same kinds of harm, not the same theatrical details, but the same forms of fear, the same recurring injuries, the same sense of a dangerous household, the historian takes notice. Not because repetition proves every detail, but because repetition suggests a shared reality underneath. The testimonies also reveal the social order in which they were given. Servants were not treated as equal moral agents. Their suffering did not automatically matter. That fact, paradoxically, can make their statements more significant when the Crown takes interest. If a state that usually disregarded servants chose to collect their voices, it suggests that something had pushed the matter beyond what could be ignored. Again, this does not prove guilt, it proves attention, and attention has motives. The archive also contains a quieter question: why did so many people speak at all? If the household had demanded silence, why did witnesses emerge? Why did servants talk? Why did villagers talk? Part of the answer is that silence is not absolute. Even in feared households, people speak when they believe speaking might protect them. People speak when they believe someone stronger is listening. People speak when the threat shifts from the household to the Crown. The moment a noble house becomes vulnerable, those beneath it may suddenly feel a narrow opening, a chance, perhaps the only chance, to put their experience into the record. That is one of the most haunting features of testimony in hierarchical societies. It often appears only after the moment when intervention is already likely. By then, the harm has already occurred. The voices enter the archive late, as if history allows suffering to become legible only when it becomes politically useful. Another complication rests in the nature of memory. Many testimonies were retrospective. People were asked to recall events that had happened months or years earlier. Memory shifts over time. Stories sharpen. Details simplify. The mind fills in gaps. Community gossip influences what individuals believe they witnessed. A witness may come to believe they saw something because they have heard it so often that it feels familiar. This is not necessarily deceit, it is how human recollection works. The record, then, becomes both invaluable and unstable. It is invaluable because it is the closest thing to a contemporary account of what people believed was happening. It is unstable because it is filtered through fear, politics, and memory. The challenge in telling this story truthfully is to honor the weight of these voices without pretending they offer modern certainty. As testimonies were collected, the story became larger than any one witness. Each account added pressure to the next. Each name suggested more names. Each allegation made it easier for other people to speak. The archive grew thicker. The case became more difficult to contain. What might once have been dismissed as village talk became a body of statements large enough to justify decisive action. And decisive action was always the destination. An investigation of this scale was never meant to remain an investigation. It was meant to lead to a conclusion. The Crown did not gather testimony simply to listen. It gathered testimony to act. Once enough voices were gathered, whether they spoke truth, fear, exaggeration, or some mixture of all three, the process could move forward. The words would become a net, and the net would tighten around Cactus. Chapter 13. Once testimonies exist, the temptation is to treat them as a single unified chorus. That is how popular retellings often handle the Bathory case. Witnesses spoke, the truth emerged, the monster was revealed. The archive is not so neat. Testimony is not a photograph. It is a human act shaped by context, language, fear, and expectation. To treat all witness statements as equal is to misunderstand what a witness is. Some people speak from direct experience. Some speak from what they have heard. Some speak from what they believe the investigator wishes to confirm. Some speak cautiously, aware that words can be punished. Some speak wildly, because a wild story is more likely to be remembered and repeated. A careful reading of the testimony gathered in the Bathory investigation requires a kind of discipline, not moral discipline, but analytical discipline. It requires sorting, weighing, and refusing the comfort of simple certainty. The most significant distinction is between direct observation and indirect report. Some witnesses claim to have seen injuries, bruises, wounds, weakness, swelling, on the bodies of servant girls. This is not uncommon in a society where physical punishment was normalized. What makes such statements potentially meaningful is their repetition and their association with a particular household. When multiple people report similar injuries among servants connected to the same estate, it suggests a pattern. It does not prove specific acts, but it does weaken the explanation of coincidence. Other witnesses spoke of disappearances. Girls who went into service and were not seen again. These statements often lack the clarity modern readers crave. Disappearances can occur for many reasons: dismissal, flight, illness, shame, death. In a world with poor record-keeping for the servant class, a young woman could vanish from community memory without leaving a trace in formal documents. Still, when disappearances are repeatedly linked, rightly or wrongly, to one household, they contribute to reputation, and reputation becomes part of what investigators treat as evidence. Some testimonies described harsher, more explicit cruelty, beatings severe enough to cause death, confinement, exposure, deliberate harm. These are the accounts that later writers have most often used to build the Countess Dracula image. They are also the accounts that must be treated with the greatest caution, not because they are necessarily false, but because they are the most vulnerable to distortion. In early modern legal investigations, the process of questioning could shape the content of what was recorded. A witness might be asked, directly or indirectly, whether they knew of specific acts. A witness might be prompted with details. The more sensational the allegation, the more likely it was to be remembered, repeated, and written down. In cases where authorities were seeking grounds for action against a noble figure, a narrative of severe cruelty could become politically useful. This does not mean it was invented. It means it lived in an environment where invention was rewarded. A further complication is the role of social position. A peasant witness might have seen a wounded servant. A peasant witness might also fear retribution. A peasant witness might assume that speaking too directly could lead to punishment. In such circumstances, witnesses often speak in the language of "it is said" and "I heard." This can be read as weakness. It can also be read as the coded speech of the vulnerable, a way of pointing without standing fully in the line of fire. The testimony also needs to be understood in the context of what servants could realistically know. Many servants did not have access to private rooms. Many did not witness events directly. They learned through sounds, through whispers, through sudden absences, through the atmosphere that follows violence. A servant who hears screams behind a door does not see violence, but they are not ignorant of it. A servant who is ordered to clean blood from linen may not witness the cause, but they understand consequence. The archive tends to privilege direct claims, but indirect knowledge can still be real knowledge. Some accounts, particularly those repeated in later retellings, include extremely high numbers of victims. These numbers often seize the imagination because they turn the story into something almost mythic. A countess with hundreds of victims resembles not a criminal but a force of nature. Yet such numbers are among the most disputed elements of the case, and they are precisely the kind of detail that grows in the retelling. Large numbers function like a spell. They make the story feel certain because they make it feel overwhelming. A responsible manuscript cannot treat such numbers as established fact unless the supporting documentation is strong, and in this case, the documentation is not strong enough to carry that certainty cleanly. It is safer and more truthful to describe the presence of such claims while making clear that victim counts were inflated in later tradition and cannot be confirmed with modern confidence. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the witness record is not only what appears within it, but what does not. There are no contemporary testimonies describing a countess bathing in blood to preserve her youth. That image, however famous, belongs to later print culture. Its absence from the early record matters. It suggests that the most iconic vampire-like element of the story was not part of the original case as it was investigated, but a later invention or embellishment, a symbol rather than a fact. The absence of such imagery is significant because it reveals how the legend was built. The case, as the state gathered it, was not primarily a Gothic tale. It was a legal and political matter shaped by testimony about harm. The Gothic elements were layered on later, as the story passed through centuries that were hungry for monsters in castles and aristocratic cruelty dressed in ritual. What the witnesses did say repeatedly was enough to create pressure. Even if many statements were indirect, even if some were exaggerated, the accumulation itself became dangerous. A powerful household can dismiss a single accusation. It struggles to dismiss dozens. It can intimidate one family. It struggles to intimidate an entire region once the crown is listening. Witnesses, in the end, did what witnesses often do in systems of inequality. They spoke imperfectly. They spoke under pressure. They spoke with fear. They spoke with anger. They spoke with gaps and contradictions. They spoke in ways that modern readers might find frustrating because modern readers want precision. But the archive is not modern. It reflects a world where truth was often negotiated inside power structures, and where people rarely had the luxury of speaking purely. This is why the Bathory case remains debated. The testimony is substantial enough to suggest that something serious occurred. It is also unstable enough to prevent clean certainty. It gives the state a foundation to act. It gives later writers material to sensationalize. It gives historians enough to argue both for and against the most extreme interpretations. It does not give the comfort of a simple answer. But it does give something else, a portrait of a society where servants could suffer and only be heard when their suffering became a political problem. A portrait of fear moving from kitchen whispers into official documents. A portrait of a noble household becoming, through accusation and investigation, a target of the crown. Once the witnesses had spoken, however imperfectly, the story had moved beyond them. From that point onward, it belonged to authority. And authority does not collect testimony unless it intends to use it. Chapter 14. Every investigation, no matter how slow, moves towards a point where it must either act or retreat. 4 months, the Bathory case had been gathering substance in the form the state understood best: names, statements, written accounts, repeated details. The rumors that had once drifted through villages were now compiled into something that could be carried into official rooms and discussed in official language. The story had been lifted out of local fear and placed within the machinery of authority. Once that happens, delay becomes risky. If a powerful household is truly dangerous, then delay means further harm. If a powerful household is merely vulnerable to political attack, then delay gives it time to defend itself, to consolidate allies, to silence witnesses, to move assets, to reshape the narrative. In either scenario, the state is pushed towards intervention. Action demonstrates control. Action prevents the case from dissolving into uncertainty. Action, even imperfect, is preferable to the appearance of weakness. For Thurzo and those acting under royal authority, intervention would not have been a theatrical raid staged for later retellings. It would have been the practical step taken once sufficient grounds, or sufficient pressure, existed to justify it. The decision to enter a noble estate and arrest a noblewoman was extraordinary. It carried risk. It demanded a form of certainty, even if that certainty was political rather than purely evidentiary. This is the moment where the castle, so long a symbol of separation, becomes reachable. Yet even as authority moves, the record must be treated carefully. Many of the most vivid details associated with Elizabeth Bathory's arrest come from later retellings that were shaped by the hunger for dramatic climax. The image is familiar: officials bursting into a torchlit chamber, discovering injured girls, catching the Countess in the act. It is an image that satisfies the narrative instinct for revelation. It is also an image that requires source support, and not all versions of the story carry the same reliability. What can be said with confidence is simpler and more restrained. By late December 1610, Thurzo and his men intervened. Elizabeth Bathory was placed under arrest and later confined. The household was disrupted. The case moved from investigation into custody. The servants closest to the household's inner workings would soon become the focus of trials. The rest, the scene itself, sits in a space where history and legend compete. This does not mean the dramatic versions are entirely false. It means they must be handled as claims, not certainties, unless a solid contemporary source can be matched to each detail. The ethical method is to narrate the intervention in the same way the archive holds it, as an action taken, followed by consequences that can be tracked. Even so, the atmosphere surrounding that moment can be approached without invention. The realities of winter travel, the practicalities of approaching a fortress, the gravity of entering a noble household with authority, these are not embellishments. They are the texture of the period. Late December in the region meant cold, short days, and nights that pressed down early. Roads could be slowed by snow, mud, and ice. Travel by horse demanded planning. A small force of officials, guards, and attendants would have been conspicuous, particularly if they moved with the purpose of intervention rather than a polite visit. Word would have traveled ahead of them, because villages notice movement. Servants notice movement. A household as politically exposed as Bathory's would not have been unaware that interest was growing. This creates a further tension, whether the household anticipated intervention, and whether anything was changed in anticipation. A powerful estate could attempt to hide evidence, dismiss servants, send people away, prepare explanations. It could also rely on privilege and assume it was untouchable. The record cannot always clarify which of these occurred, but the question remains relevant because it affects how testimony and later claims are interpreted. When authority entered the castle, it entered not only a building but a system of power that had governed the lives inside it. For servants, this would have been a moment of danger as much as relief. Intervention does not automatically protect the vulnerable. It can expose them. Those who had suffered might be questioned. Those who had participated, willingly or under coercion, might be accused. Those who had kept silent might be blamed. A household brought under investigation becomes a place where fear shifts direction rather than disappearing. And this is where the story begins to change shape. Before intervention, the case was an atmosphere, rumors, patterns, whispered warnings. After intervention, the case becomes a legal event. It gains dates, custody, trials, sentences. It enters the archive in a way rumors cannot. The state begins to produce the documents that later centuries will treat as proof, even though documents are only as honest as the humans who create them. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory did not immediately answer the central questions. It did not reveal cleanly whether she was guilty of the most extreme allegations. It did not settle the debate about how many died, or why the Crown chose to act when it did. What it did do was take control of the narrative away from the household and place it in the hands of authority. That transfer is significant because it changed what could be said. Once Bathory was in custody, witnesses who had been afraid to speak might have felt a narrow opening. Others might have sensed that speaking was now expected. Some might have exaggerated. Some might have minimized. Some might have altered their accounts to protect themselves. Some might have finally told the truth. The pressure to produce a coherent story would have increased, because the state now had to justify its intervention. It had to demonstrate that it acted with reason, that it did not overreach, that it was not simply attacking a noblewoman for political gain. Intervention creates its own need for narrative. A crown does not like ambiguity. It prefers resolution, particularly when its actions involve noble blood. In the aftermath of intervention, the focus of the case shifted. Elizabeth Bathory's status protected her from the immediate public punishment that servants would face. She would not be treated as an ordinary accused. The state solution would be shaped by compromise, containing the scandal without triggering the full consequences of a noble trial. The servants, however, could be tried. And through their trials, the state could begin to assemble a version of the story that was clear enough to close the case, whether or not it captured the full truth. The castle, once a symbol of impenetrable authority, had been entered. The next stage would not take place in whispers. It would take place in court. Chapter 15. History often arrives with a door opening. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory is one of those moments that later centuries have treated as a single dramatic scene, the instant the legend becomes real. In popular retellings, it is often described as a raid, a discovery, a confrontation, an unmasking. The Countess is caught mid-crime, surrounded by evidence, her household exposed in a blaze of torchlight. It is a climax shaped for readers who want the truth to announce itself with certainty. The archive is more cautious. What can be said with confidence is that by late December 1610, Georgi Thurzo and his men entered Cactus and took Elizabeth Bathory into custody. She was arrested and later confined. From that point onward, the household was under the Crown's control. Servants were detained. Witnesses were questioned. The case moved from investigation into prosecution. This alone is significant. Arresting a noblewoman was not a casual act. It required political backing, legal justification, and a willingness to manage the consequences. It meant that the Crown and its representatives believed they had enough testimony, enough pressure, enough risk, to act. Yet the question that haunts the arrest is the question of what was found. Some versions of the story claim that officials discovered victims in the castle, injured girls, dead bodies, evidence so immediate that it removed all doubt. These accounts have become central to the mythic force of the case, because they provide a satisfying certainty: the monster was caught in the act. The problem is that details like these, repeated and polished over time, are often difficult to anchor securely to contemporary documentation. They may have roots in statements recorded during the investigation. They may also have been sharpened by later writers. The historian's task is not to deny the possibility of such discoveries, but to resist the urge to narrate them as unchallenged fact when the surviving record cannot fully carry that weight. This distinction matters because it shapes the tone of the entire case. If the arrest involved immediate discovery of victims, then the Crown's intervention appears as a late but decisive response to undeniable violence. If the arrest was based primarily on accumulated testimony and reputation, then intervention becomes a political act shaped as much by narrative and necessity as by direct observation. It is possible that both are partially true. It is possible that Thurzo entered the castle and found evidence consistent with allegations, while also relying on months of collected testimony. It is possible that later retellings intensified what was found because dramatic discovery makes for a stronger story than procedural arrest. And it is possible that once the state acted, the state itself helped create the conditions for the story to become more vivid, because vivid stories justify decisive action. Still, even without the most sensational details, the arrest carried a particular atmosphere of fear. A fortress does not welcome authority lightly. Even when authority is legitimate, it arrives as intrusion. A noble household is accustomed to receiving guests, priests, messengers, neighboring nobles, but it is not accustomed to being entered as a suspect. The difference lies not in the number of men who cross the threshold, but in the purpose they bring with them. A visit can be managed with etiquette. An arrest cannot. For the servants inside, the arrival of officials would have been a rupture. A feared household suddenly becomes vulnerable. The chain of command is interrupted. The people who once commanded punishment are themselves subject to scrutiny. Those who have endured may feel relief, but relief is rarely pure. It carries dread: what will be asked, what will be demanded, what will happen to those who speak. A household like this, at the moment of arrest, becomes a place where everyone is watching everyone else. The Countess herself, once arrested, entered a legal world that treated her differently from those beneath her. Her noble status did not make her immune, but it shaped the manner of her handling. The Crown needed to contain her without igniting a noble conflict. It needed to prevent scandal from spreading too widely while still demonstrating authority. It needed a solution that balanced justice, politics, and reputation. That balance is one reason the case took the shape it did. Servants would be tried, Bathory would be confined. But before those outcomes became clear, the arrest marked the end of one era of the story and the beginning of another. Before arrest, the Bathory case existed as a local dread, a story whispered in villages, carried by families who had lost girls and could not prove how. After arrest, the case became a legal and political object. It was now something that could be controlled by documents, shaped by trial, and resolved through punishment. What was whispered could now be written. This is not a guarantee of truth. Writing does not purify story. Sometimes it hardens distortion. But the act of arrest created an archive that would outlive the witnesses themselves. It created a record that later centuries would mine for horror and certainty, even when the record itself remained complicated. If there were injured girls, if there were dead bodies, if there were immediate evidence within the castle, those facts would have been interpreted through the same lens as everything else, a lens shaped by politics, by class, by the crown's need to justify intervention. Evidence is never read in a vacuum. It is read in context. Yet the arrest had undeniable consequences. The household was seized. Servants were detained. Questioning intensified. The state began to gather not only testimony but prosecutable material. The story became less about what villagers feared and more about what the crown could claim. And once the crown begins to claim, the narrative gains force. This is where the legend begins to tighten around the historical woman. Elizabeth Bathory was no longer only a noble widow surrounded by rumor. She was now the central figure in an official case of violence, a case strong enough to justify her removal from power and her confinement until death. The question of what exactly happened at the moment of arrest may remain contested in the details. But the meaning of the arrest is clear. A fortress had been entered. A noblewoman had been taken. And the state had decided that the silence surrounding Countess would not continue unchallenged. Chapter 16. The state rarely begins by punishing the most powerful. It begins with the people it can reach. Once Elizabeth Bathory was in custody, the case did not move immediately towards a public reckoning with her. It moved instead towards her household, the servants, attendants, and aides who lived closest to the daily workings of the estate. This was practical. Servants were easier to arrest, easier to question, easier to convict. Their bodies were not protected by the same legal and social armor that surrounded a noblewoman. Their suffering could be used to support a narrative without risking the political consequences of putting aristocratic blood openly on trial. In many ways, the trials of Bathory's servants became the state's solution, a way to demonstrate action, deliver punishment, and close the case in a form that preserved the broader order. These trials, held in early 1611, are among the most concrete anchors in the Bathory story. They are not legend. They are part of the legal record, and they matter because they show that the crown did not treat the allegations as mere gossip. The state prosecuted people connected to the household and imposed severe penalties. Several were executed. Others faced punishments that spoke not of mild wrongdoing, but of acts the court regarded as extreme. The servants are sometimes treated in later retellings as mere extensions of the countess, faceless accomplices in a Gothic theatre. The archive suggests something more complicated. Servants were not a single class acting with unified purpose. They were individuals living under extreme hierarchy. Some may have been victims. Some may have participated willingly. Some may have been coerced. Some may have played roles shaped by fear and survival rather than loyalty. In cases of household violence, servants occupy a bleak position. They can become both witnesses and suspects, both the harmed and the accused. When the state moves in, it often demands a clear line between innocence and guilt. But households built on domination do not always produce clean moral categories. They produce people who do what they must to endure. The proceedings against the servants were not conducted with modern legal safeguards. Early 17th century courts could be brutal. Confessions might be extracted under pressure. Interrogations could be harsh. Witnesses could be influenced by fear of punishment. The goal of the trial was not necessarily to discover an objective truth in the modern sense. It was to establish guilt in a manner that satisfied the legal and political needs of the moment. This does not mean the convictions were false. It means the process was shaped by a system that valued resolution over nuance. Servant trials also function as a narrative tool for the state. They help create a coherent story. If the Crown wanted to justify Bathory's arrest and confinement without staging a public trial for her, convicting her household was an effective strategy. It allowed the authorities to present the crimes as real and severe, while keeping the Countess herself largely contained behind the walls of privilege. At the same time, the trials could not avoid implicating the household's culture. Servants do not act in isolation. Their actions exist within the rules set by those above them. If servants confess to harming girls, the question naturally follows: were they acting on their own initiative, or were they acting within a system directed by the mistress of the estate? The legal record could punish servants without answering that question fully, because answering it fully would require confronting the Countess in a public forum, and public confrontation was precisely what the Crown seemed to want to avoid. This avoidance is one of the case's most persistent tensions. It is not unusual historically for states to handle powerful suspects differently. But the gap between the severity of allegations and the absence of a full public trial remains striking. The executions of servants did not close the story neatly. They hardened it. For the local world, the sight of punishment would have confirmed what many had already believed, that something dreadful had been happening behind the castle walls. For later centuries, the servant trials became a kind of proof point, evidence that the case was real, that it was not purely a folklore invention. For the legend makers, it was a gift: servants executed, a countess confined, a castle stained with accusation. These are elements that invite Gothic interpretation even when the record remains murky in the details. For the victims, those whose bodies and lives were at the center of the allegations, the trials offered only partial recognition. Servant girls rarely receive names in the record. They become numbers, categories, anonymous dead. The focus of the archive, as so often in cases of inequality, is on the accused and the powerful. The injured and the lost remain largely voiceless, their individual lives swallowed by the story told about them. This is one of the quiet violences of historical true crime. The record remembers the monster more clearly than it remembers the people harmed. Still, the servant trials did something essential. They created a legal outcome. They produced punishments that can be traced. They established, at least from the state's perspective, that crimes had been committed within the Bathory household. They also created a boundary: the servants would carry the public weight of guilt, while the Countess herself would be handled differently. In later retellings, this distinction is sometimes ignored. The Countess is presented as tried and sentenced like an ordinary criminal, condemned in open court, punished for her crimes. That is not what occurred. The state did not take her to the scaffold. It did not stage a public trial that would expose noble privilege to public scrutiny. It chose another route. The servant trials, then, are not merely an episode. They are a clue. They show the state's willingness to punish. They also show the state's caution. They suggest that the Crown wanted the case resolved, but not at any cost. It wanted evidence, but not a spectacle that might destabilize aristocratic trust. It wanted justice, but a justice arranged around class. And while the servants faced judgment in court, Elizabeth Bathory remained where the state could keep her contained. Not innocent. Not executed. Simply removed from the world. Chapter 17. The most revealing absence in the Bathory case is not a missing document or an uncertain date. It is the missing spectacle of a public trial. In a story so saturated with accusation, so weighted with violence, so heavy with later legend, modern readers often assume a dramatic judicial ending: the Countess brought before a court, confronted with charges, condemned in full view of the world. This is the shape that crime narratives prefer, because it delivers moral clarity. The monster is named, judged, and punished. That shape was not available here. Elizabeth Bathory was not tried in a public court like an ordinary criminal. The state did not parade her before the people. It did not subject her to the formal process that would have produced a clean transcript of guilt or innocence. Instead, she was confined, her power broken not through theatrical justice but through removal. This outcome was not accidental. It was a choice shaped by class, law, and politics. In the early 17th century, the nobility did not exist under the same legal conditions as the poor. Noble privilege was not merely social, it was embedded in the structure of governance. A noblewoman of Bathory's rank was part of the very class that supported the state. Her family connections mattered. Her estates mattered. Her alliances mattered. To put her on trial publicly would have been to pull on a thread that could unravel more than one household's reputation. A public trial would have forced the Crown to do several dangerous things at once. It would have required the formal presentation of testimony against a noble figure. It would have demanded that the state openly declare a noblewoman guilty of crimes severe enough to justify extraordinary punishment. It would have risked creating a precedent. If Bathory could be tried and executed, then any noble family could imagine itself vulnerable. The aristocracy might begin to fear the Crown more than it feared scandal, and fear does not produce loyalty. It would also have required the state to confront the question of evidence in a way it may not have been comfortable doing. Much of the case relied on testimony, some direct, much indirect. A public trial would have made that evidence vulnerable to scrutiny by other nobles, who would have had both the education and the interest to dissect it. A powerful defense could argue that witnesses were unreliable, that statements were coerced, that rumors were mistaken, that political motives shaped the case. Even if Bathory were guilty, a contested trial could have produced uncertainty rather than closure. The Crown did not need uncertainty. It needed resolution. Confined aristocrats create less instability than executed aristocrats. There is also the practical issue of managing scandal. A public trial is not a quiet thing. It draws attention. It invites gossip across borders. It gives other powers a story to use. It humiliates families who might otherwise remain loyal. It also feeds public imagination. The very spectacle of a noblewoman on trial would have expanded the legend far beyond what any private confinement could do. If the Crown wanted to contain the story, a public trial was the wrong instrument. A public trial would have created a document trail that later centuries could treat as definitive. It would have produced a clear legal narrative, and that narrative could be either damaging or inconvenient depending on what it revealed. If the state could resolve the matter without exposing the full details, it could maintain control of what was known. That is what confinement offered. Confinement allowed the Crown to neutralize Elizabeth Bathory as a threat without forcing the aristocracy to watch one of its own destroyed in open court. It allowed officials to act while still preserving the illusion that the noble order remained intact. It also allowed the state to avoid the risk of a trial that might not go the way it wanted. From the perspective of power, it was an elegant solution. From the perspective of truth, it is profoundly frustrating. Without a public trial, the case remains suspended in ambiguity. There is no single moment where guilt is formally established before the world. There is no full cross-examination of witnesses. There is no definitive verdict that satisfies modern standards of justice. Instead, there is action, arrest, confinement, the prosecution of servants, and the quiet removal of the Countess from public life. This outcome has fueled debate ever since. Those who believe Bathory was guilty view confinement as a compromise shaped by privilege, a way to spare a noblewoman the punishment her servants faced. Those who believe the case was exaggerated or politically motivated view the absence of a public trial as suspicious, a sign that the evidence might not have survived open scrutiny. Both interpretations carry weight. The archive supports the idea that the state believed enough to act. It also supports the reality that the state acted in a way designed to protect itself from the consequences of its own action. These are not contradictions. They are how power behaves. There is another possibility, quieter but worth considering. The Crown may have viewed Bathory not only as a legal problem but as a problem of governance. A public trial would have been a solution within the language of morality. Confinement was a solution within the language of administration. Remove the disruptive figure, stabilize the region, and move on. The servants' executions served as public proof that wrongdoing had been punished. The Countess's confinement served as private containment of a scandal that could not be allowed to spread too far. This is the logic of a state concerned less with moral purity than with stability. In later centuries, the vampire legend grows partly out of this missing trial. When there is no definitive public reckoning, story rushes to fill the gap. People prefer certainty, and if the archive does not provide it, myth will. The absence of a formal courtroom verdict leaves space for imagination to produce its own verdict, one that is often more dramatic, more supernatural, and more satisfying than history allows. That is one reason Elizabeth Bathory becomes Countess Dracula. A woman confined without public trial is easier to transform into a figure of Gothic mystery. The castle becomes a sealed vault. The truth becomes a secret. The imagination supplies what the record withholds. The state's choice not to try her publicly did not prevent legend. It made legend inevitable. And while the servants' trials provided the public punishment the crown could safely deliver, the Countess herself slipped into a different kind of sentence, one that would last until her death. Chapter 18. A prison does not always have iron bars. Sometimes it has familiar stone, familiar rooms, and a door that no longer opens. After the servant trials and the state's decision not to place Elizabeth Bathory on public trial, the case entered its strangest and most gothic phase, not because of blood or myth, but because of how the crown chose to end her life in the world. She was confined, removed from authority, sealed away from the public gaze. Not executed, not absolved, but contained. Confinement is a political instrument as much as it is a punishment. It neutralizes a person without the spectacle of death. It avoids the complications of public court proceedings. It prevents the accused from speaking in ways that could destabilize other powers. It also allows the state to maintain an appearance of control without inviting the wider consequences of execution. For a noblewoman, confinement was both merciful and cruel. Merciful in that it spared her the scaffold. Cruel in that it reduced her existence to a narrowing of space and time, with the world continuing beyond the walls she could no longer command. The specifics of Bathory's confinement are debated in the details, and later retellings have often presented it as a kind of immurement. The Countess bricked into a room with only a small opening for food, left to rot in darkness like a living corpse. This image is intensely compelling, and it suits the Gothic imagination perfectly. It also risks becoming another legend layered over uncertain record. The truth is more careful. Accounts differ. Some descriptions suggest severe restrictions, others suggest a form of house arrest within the castle, with access to servants and limited movement. It is likely that confinement changed over time, tightening or loosening according to the state's needs, local management, and the ongoing concern of scandal. What can be said with confidence is that her freedom was removed and her power broken. Even a less theatrical confinement would still have been a psychological collapse. For years, Elizabeth Bathory had lived within structures that granted her authority, a household that obeyed, estates that depended on her governance, a name that commanded deference. Suddenly, she was no longer the center of command. She was the object being managed. She was no longer the one who issued orders. She was the person whose movements were controlled. That reversal is a form of death. In such circumstances, the castle itself becomes something different. Once, Countess and the estates associated with her were symbols of status and security. Under confinement, they became boundaries. Familiar corridors became limits. Doors became assertions of the crown's will. Every locked threshold became a reminder that power had shifted elsewhere. For a woman of her rank, confinement would have been saturated with humiliation even if it was not physically brutal. Nobility is built on the public performance of authority. To be reduced to private containment is to be stripped of the very thing that makes one noble: autonomy, reputation, influence, reach. The state's decision to confine rather than execute also preserved uncertainty, which may have suited the crown but did not suit those who wanted moral clarity. In local communities, the Countess's confinement might have felt like incomplete justice. Servants had been tried and executed, their bodies paid the full price of the case. The alleged architect of the household's cruelty remained alive, protected by rank even in punishment. This resentment, whether spoken or silent, would have fed the legend as surely as any later sensational writer. When justice is unequal, people reach for explanations. If the law will not punish fully, folklore will. The monster will be punished in story, even if not in life. Confinement also created the perfect conditions for myth-making. A noblewoman sealed away behind castle walls becomes a figure of mystery. People cannot see her. They cannot hear her speak publicly. They cannot know her daily life. Into that darkness, imagination pours what it needs: suffering, rage, madness, supernatural hunger. The less is known, the more can be invented. This is not unique to Bathory. History is full of confined women turned into symbols precisely because they were denied the ability to exist as ordinary human beings in public. Their silence becomes a canvas. But there is another, colder reality beneath the myth. Confinement was not only a punishment for Elizabeth Bathory. It was a containment of risk. A public trial would have produced documents, statements, and contradictions that other nobles could study. It could have exposed the state's own vulnerabilities, how it gathered evidence, how it handled testimony, how it treated noble privilege. By confining Bathory quietly, the crown avoided those exposures. It shut down her ability to dispute the case in public. It also prevented the possibility of her family using her as a rallying point. In this sense, her confinement served the state's interests as much as it served any idea of justice. The days inside confinement would have been monotonous, controlled, and heavy with time. If her restrictions were severe, the monotony would have been suffocating. If her restrictions were less absolute, the monotony would still have been humiliating. The knowledge that movement required permission, that visitors were controlled, that correspondence could be monitored, that the estate no longer belonged to her in the way it once had. The castle, which once stood as a fortress against external enemies, now functioned as a fortress against her. Even the most practical details of daily life become sinister in confinement. The sound of keys. The delay of footsteps outside a door. The quiet exchange of food. The reduction of conversation. The shrinking of future. A person can endure imprisonment for years and still experience each day as a fresh narrowing. This is the part of the story where later retellings often slip into the supernatural, because confinement feels like haunting. A powerful woman held in a castle, isolated until death, becomes an easy figure for Gothic imagination. She resembles a creature sealed away to protect the world from her. She resembles, in story, a monster trapped in its lair. But the record does not require a vampire to produce horror here. The horror is human. A woman was removed from life without public trial. Her servants were executed. Her name became synonymous with violence, whether earned, exaggerated, or politically shaped. She remained alive long enough to know the world had decided she was dangerous. She remained alive long enough to be transformed, in the minds of others, into something more than human. This is where Countess Dracula begins to feel inevitable, not as a fact of the record, but as a consequence of its shape. A woman confined behind stone walls becomes, in folklore, a creature behind stone walls. An aristocrat becomes an immortal aristocrat. A household accused of consuming young bodies becomes, in the imagination, a household that consumes youth itself. If there is a shadow in this story that does not belong to superstition, it belongs to the way power behaves. The state chose a punishment that preserved order and protected itself. It chose silence over spectacle. It chose containment over clarity. And in doing so, it left the world with a sealed room where certainty should have been. The Countess remained confined until 1614. Chapter 19. The record of Elizabeth Bathory ends the way many records do, not with revelation, but with silence. She died in custody in 1614, still confined, still removed from the public world, still enclosed within the solution the state had chosen. There was no public trial to conclude her case, no formal verdict delivered in an open courtroom, no final speech, no final reckoning that might satisfy a modern reader's need for closure. Her life, once vast with estates and influence, narrowed into confinement and ended there. What remains is a date, an ending, and the familiar problem of historical distance. Accounts of her death are less vivid than the stories that surrounded her arrest. This is partly because confinement is designed to reduce attention. It is meant to end a problem quietly. It is also partly because death itself, in early modern archives, is often recorded with economy unless it carries immediate political consequence. Bathory's death was significant, but not in a way that required ceremony. The state had already neutralized her. The scandal had already been contained. The household had already been dismantled. Her death did not threaten stability. In a sense, it resolved what confinement was designed to resolve. It ended her without spectacle. Yet even this quiet end carried weight. Death in custody did not erase the question of guilt. It did not erase the question of motive. It did not clarify how much of the testimony was fact, how much fear, how much rumor, how much political advantage. It simply froze the story in its most frustrating form, a case strong enough to justify arrest and confinement, yet never publicly adjudicated. That absence is one reason the case remained alive in imagination. A story without a public conclusion invites retelling. A story without a definitive trial invites argument. A story that ends in confinement invites myth, because confinement resembles the ending of fairy tales, the monster locked away, the door sealed, the danger contained. If Elizabeth Bathory had been executed publicly, the story might have been grim but clear. The state would have placed its judgment on display, and later centuries would have read that judgment as proof. Confinement followed by death is less clear. It invites suspicion from those who see privilege protecting her. It invites suspicion from those who see the state avoiding scrutiny. It invites those who want certainty to search for it elsewhere, in folklore, in sensational accounts, in Gothic invention. This is where the record begins to lose its hold on the narrative. After Bathory's death, the state's immediate need was finished. Whatever had been happening within her household, whether as described, exaggerated, or politically shaped, had been halted. The crown had demonstrated authority. The servant trials had provided public punishment. The countess's confinement had removed her from influence. With her death, even the possibility of her return to power vanished. But stories rarely die when the subject dies. In the villages around Cactus, the memory of fear would have lingered. Families who believed they had lost daughters to the household would have carried grief that did not require official validation. Servants who had lived through the estate's internal regime would have carried memories that did not disappear simply because the mistress did. Priests and locals who had suspected harm would have carried the knowledge that their suspicions had been taken seriously enough to bring the crown down upon the castle. Even if the details were unclear, the outcome was clear: the countess fell. That fall, without public trial, allowed the story to become flexible. It could be shaped to serve different purposes. In some retellings, Bathory became the embodiment of aristocratic cruelty, a warning about power and privilege. In others, she became a victim of political maneuvering, a warning about the crown's ability to destroy inconvenient nobles. In others, she became a Gothic figure, more symbol than human, a countess who consumed youth, who bathed in blood, who lived beyond ordinary morality. Death did not close these interpretations. It allowed them to multiply. The circumstances of her burial have been discussed and disputed in various accounts. The details shift in the telling, as they often do in cases that become legendary. What matters for the narrative is not the exact placement of a body, but the way a body becomes a vessel for meaning. In a story like this, burial becomes symbolic, whether she was buried quietly, whether her body was moved, whether her resting place was contested. These questions persist because they reflect a deeper unease. People want the monster to stay contained. They want the grave to be certain. They want the dead to remain dead. This is one of the reasons vampire lore attaches so naturally to the Bathory story. Vampires, in folklore, are figures who do not stay where they are placed. Their graves are unstable. Their bodies refuse to be final. The vampire motif is not proven by the archive, but it thrives in the spaces where the archive is thin. It feeds on uncertainty. It turns unresolved guilt into eternal hunger. It transforms a noblewoman's confinement into a supernatural containment. And once the countess is imagined as a creature who does not die properly, every historical gap becomes a doorway for myth. Still, at the level of recorded history, her life ends here. Confined after arrest, removed from power, held until death. This is the most reliable conclusion the archive provides. It is not satisfying. It is not dramatic. It is not a moral spectacle. It is administrative, political, and quiet. And perhaps that is what makes it so haunting. A story built from rumors of violence, from testimonies of cruelty, from executions, and from a noblewoman sealed away until she dies is not a story that resolves with justice. It resolves with containment. The record closes. After this point, the shape of the tale changes. The state has finished with Elizabeth Bathory. History, in its official form, grows quieter. The living move on. But the story begins its second life, the life that would eventually name her Countess Dracula. Not because the archive proves the vampire. Because the archive leaves enough darkness for one to be born. Chapter 20. When the accused dies, the state can finally stop managing the case. It does not have to balance noble privilege against public anger. It does not have to contain a living scandal. It does not have to decide how much to reveal, how much to conceal, how much to punish, how much to spare. The problem ends in the most practical way. The subject can no longer speak, cannot return to power, cannot become a rallying figure for family or faction. That was the quiet usefulness of Elizabeth Bathory's death. But for the people who lived in the shadow of Cactus, the story did not end with administrative finality. Stories do not behave like legal files. They do not close cleanly. They spill over into memory and into warning, into resentment and into fascination. They change shape with each mouth that repeats them. After 1614, the case moved into a phase where it could no longer be controlled by the crown alone. The state had taken action, but but it had not offered the kind of public clarity that settles a community's imagination. There had been trials for servants, yes, and those trials were severe enough to confirm that wrongdoing had been punished. Yet the central figure remained untried in public. She had been confined, then she had died. The state's solution was practical, but it was not narratively satisfying. That is a dangerous thing to leave behind. In the absence of a definitive trial, the aftermath becomes a landscape where multiple versions of the truth compete. A family that believed a daughter had disappeared into the household service carried grief that could not be undone by court proceedings. A villager who had long feared the Countess carried the satisfaction of seeing her removed, even without knowing exactly what she had done. A local official who had avoided involvement carried the relief of survival. A former servant carried memories that might never be spoken aloud, because speaking had never been safe. Each person became a keeper of a different story. In some communities, the fall of a powerful figure becomes a warning that restrains other nobles. In others, it becomes a cautionary tale about how quickly a reputation can destroy a person. In others, it becomes proof that the crown will act, but only when it chooses. The Bathory case could serve all of these functions at once. The household itself, stripped of its mistress and disrupted by trials, would not have returned smoothly to its former shape. Estates do not collapse overnight, but they do change when authority shifts. Servants leave. Stewards change. New management arrives. Old loyalties become liabilities. The state's intervention leaves scars, and people move carefully around scars. What survives from such a period is often the emotional residue rather than detailed fact. People remember fear more vividly than they remember dates. They remember the atmosphere around the castle more vividly than they remember the exact content of testimony. They remember that something happened, that something was said, that something was punished. In time, something happened becomes everyone knew. The case also lived on because it was unusual enough to stay memorable. Powerful people were not often confined and removed so decisively, especially not women of such rank. Even without the supernatural, the shape of the story was already Gothic: a wealthy countess, a castle, rumors of cruelty, a high-level investigation, servants executed, and the Countess herself sealed away until death. The narrative contained all the ingredients a later imagination would need. But at first, the story remained closer to its original frame, a scandal and a criminal case, not yet a vampire myth. In the years after her death, the memory of Bathory would have been carried by several channels. Oral tradition, certainly, but also documents, notes, proceedings, correspondence, references in legal and administrative records. The state's file did not vanish. It remained, as such files often do, available to those with access. Over time, the story would be retold not only by villagers but by people who could read, people who could write, people who could turn the case into a moral tale or a cautionary history. This is one of the most important shifts in the life of the Bathory legend, the moment it moved from lived memory into text. Oral stories change quickly, but they also die quickly if they do not serve a purpose. Written stories change differently. They can persist long after the original witnesses are dead. They can travel further. They can be copied. They can be embellished by authors who were never there and do not need to fear consequences. They can be shaped to suit the tastes of their era. Once Bathory's story entered print culture, it became vulnerable to a new kind of transformation, the transformation from case into legend. In the local world, rumors were constrained by proximity. People could be challenged by neighbors. They could be contradicted by those who knew the household personally. They had to live beside the estates and the families involved. In print culture, those constraints weaken. A writer does not have to live near Cactus. A writer does not have to fear the Bathory name. A writer can choose the most sensational details because sensational details sell, and because the dead cannot sue. This is not to say every later writer was dishonest. Many were working with fragments. Many were repeating what had become common belief. Many were reshaping the story into moral lesson. But moral lessons require archetypes, not messy ambiguity. They need villains, not contested evidence. They need clear wrongdoing, not a complex interplay of politics and testimony. The aftermath of Bathory's death created precisely the conditions in which archetype could flourish. A powerful woman, once reduced to confinement, becomes easier to imagine as inherently monstrous. Her fall is interpreted as proof of guilt rather than as a political compromise. Her household's crimes, whether committed under her direction or by those around her, are gathered into a single coherent image. The case becomes less about what is proven and more about what is satisfying. And satisfaction in stories often comes from excess. Over time, the Bathory story began to attract a particular obsession: youth. The victims described in later accounts are often young women. The alleged violence is framed not merely as cruelty, but as consumption. The Countess is imagined as taking something from the young, their beauty, their vitality, their life itself. This is the psychological seed of the vampire motif. It is not evidence of vampirism. It is evidence of the kind of fear the story evokes. A noblewoman feeding on youth is a metaphor for aristocratic power. The rich live longer while the poor die younger. The powerful draw comfort from the labor and bodies of others. The vampire myth makes that reality literal. It turns social exploitation into supernatural hunger. This is why the Bathory legend persists so strongly. It offers a language for a truth that feels too ugly to name plainly, that power can devour. In the years after her death, the record remained, but the record was not what carried the story forward. People did. And people do not preserve nuance the way archives do. They preserve what strikes them, what frightens them, what fascinates them, what warns them. With each retelling, the story became a little more shaped. With each shaping, it became a little less historical. And with each century, the shadow grew larger than the woman it was attached to. Chapter 21. There is a moment in every legend when the story stops behaving like a case and starts behaving like myth. In Elizabeth Bathory's story, that moment does not occur in 1610. It does not occur at the arrest. It does not occur at the servant trials, or even at her death in custody. Those events belong to the historical arc: allegations gathered into testimony, authority turning rumor into action, punishment delivered unevenly, a noblewoman confined until life ended quietly behind stone. The myth begins later, when the story is no longer constrained by the people who lived near it. By the time the most famous image of Bathory entered the public imagination, the Countess bathing in blood to preserve her youth, the witnesses were long dead, and the political urgency that shaped the original case had cooled into history. The state's management of scandal had given way to the public's appetite for meaning. The archive had become a quarry for writers rather than a tool for governance. That is when blood became symbol. The blood-bathing motif is now the centerpiece of what most people believe about Elizabeth Bathory. It is repeated so frequently that it feels inseparable from her name. It has the vivid clarity of folklore, a beautiful countess, terrified of aging, willing to sacrifice young bodies to remain untouched by time. It is not merely cruelty. It is ritual. It is consumption. It is a story built to lodge in the mind. And that is precisely the problem. When a detail is too perfect, it demands scrutiny. The earliest materials connected to the case, the investigation, the testimonies, the servant trials, do not contain this image in the way later culture insists upon it. The record preserves allegations of violence and cruelty, but it does not preserve the vampire-like ritual that later writers present as established fact. This absence matters. It does not prove that nothing extraordinary occurred. It proves that the most iconic element of the legend belongs to a different phase of the story, the phase in which writers were no longer reporting a case, but shaping a tale. This is the point where historical truth and narrative hunger diverge. It is tempting to treat legend as merely false. But legend is rarely only a lie. More often it is an answer to a question that history refuses to resolve. Where the archive is ambiguous, the imagination becomes decisive. Where the evidence is uneven, story becomes smooth. Where the state's punishment was unequal, folklore invents a punishment that feels proportionate. The blood-bathing image functions in precisely this way. It transforms a contested case, one with many testimonies and many uncertainties, into a clear moral horror. It offers a single unforgettable reason for fear. It explains the absence of public trial by recasting confinement as containment of a supernatural threat. It turns administrative silence into Gothic mystery. It turns a noblewoman into something the world already knows how to hate. Blood, in this telling, is not simply blood. It is youth. It is purity. It is life stolen from the vulnerable. It makes the Countess's alleged violence legible in a way that ordinary cruelty, however severe, often fails to be. Ordinary cruelty is too common. It does not satisfy the need to make sense of why this case endured. Ritual does. The transformation of Bathory into a figure who consumes youth also solves a deeper discomfort. Aristocratic violence is not supposed to be visible. Nobility is meant to be refined. If a noblewoman is accused of brutality, the mind reaches for an explanation that matches the shock. The blood-bathing motif provides that explanation. It makes her crimes not merely criminal but unnatural. It allows society to say, this is not what nobility is. This is something else. This is one of the oldest uses of monstrosity. The monster is created to isolate a fear that is too close to home. The timing of this transformation matters. By the 18th century, Europe's relationship with stories had shifted. Printing was more widespread. Moral tales traveled further. Crime, scandal, and aristocratic excess were popular material. Writers were less constrained by personal risk and more guided by what would hold attention. The Bathory case, already rich with Gothic elements, became ideal fuel. When a story enters print culture, it changes its purpose. It no longer exists primarily to warn a village or justify a state action. It exists to be read, to be repeated, to be sold, to be remembered. And what is remembered is rarely what is most accurate. It is what is most vivid. A woman who beats servants is horrible, but it is not unique in a violent age. A woman who bathes in blood to preserve youth becomes immortal in the imagination. The image is too potent to fade. It offers the reader not only fear but fascination, the twisted glamour of power, the grotesque intimacy of bodily ritual, the inversion of femininity into something predatory. This is where the vampire enters, not as a creature with fangs, but as an idea with purpose. The vampire myth is a cultural mechanism for explaining a particular kind of exploitation. Vampires are often aristocratic. They live above ordinary people. They feed without labor. They drain life and remain untouched by time. They offer an image of power that consumes. When this motif attaches itself to Bathory, it does so because it fits the social truth beneath the case. A noble household accused of harming the young and powerless, protected by status, and never brought to full public reckoning. The vampire is not proven by the archive. It is summoned by what the archive cannot resolve. The gap between the early case record and the later blood-bathing legend should not be treated as a mere footnote. It is one of the most important truths in the entire Bathory story, because it reveals how the world constructed Countess Dracula. The Countess did not need to be supernatural to become supernatural. She needed only to be ambiguous, and for that ambiguity to survive long enough to be reshaped by the needs of later centuries. When a story endures, it does not endure unchanged. It evolves to remain useful. In Bathory's case, the evolution moved in a particular direction, towards youth, blood, and ritual. Those elements did not arise randomly. They reflect cultural anxieties that were already present: fear of female power, fear of aging, fascination with aristocratic excess, and the horror of exploitation made literal. The myth does not replace the record. It sits beside it like a shadow that refuses to detach. This shadow has consequences. It encourages readers to treat the most vivid elements as the truest. It tempts writers to weave the blood-bathing image into chapters where it does not belong historically. It encourages the belief that the case was simple: a vampire countess caught and punished. The truth is harder and colder. The historical case offers action without spectacle, punishment without equality, and an ending without verdict. The legend offers spectacle, certainty, and the satisfaction of believing the monster was properly named. This chapter marks the point where the legend begins to overtake the record. From here, the story will move into the centuries that made Elizabeth Bathory into Countess Dracula, not because history proved the vampire, but because culture demanded one. And when culture demands a monster, it does not ask for evidence. It asks for an image it can never forget. Chapter 22. Once a story enters print, it becomes vulnerable to the tastes of the age that repeats it. Elizabeth Bathory's case, as a legal and political event, belonged to the early 17th century. Its evidence was testimony. Its resolution was confinement. Its public punishment was directed mostly at servants. Its conclusion was quiet. None of this is unusual for a state-managing scandal among the aristocracy. What is unusual is what happened after, the way the case escaped its own era and was reshaped into an enduring Gothic myth. This reshaping did not require the supernatural to be real. It required only a particular cultural climate, one that was already fascinated by cruelty behind refinement, by castles as symbols of secrecy, by the idea that the powerful feed on the powerless. That climate arrived in force as Europe moved through the 18th and 19th centuries. The Gothic era did not invent aristocratic violence. It invented a new language for it. It took real anxieties, about inherited power, about class exploitation, about sexuality, about hidden sin, and translated them into art that was designed to unsettle. The settings were often medieval or early modern. The villains were often nobles. The architecture was often a fortress or a decaying estate. The central horror was often not a monster from outside but corruption within, a house that looked grand from the road and hid something rotten behind its walls. Bathory's story arrived pre-built for this genre. A countess. A castle. Young women vanishing into service. Whispered cruelty. A high-level investigation. Servants executed. A noblewoman sealed away until death. Even without the later blood-bathing motif, the case already had the structure of a Gothic narrative: power enclosed within stone, violence concealed by hierarchy, the ordinary world unable to intervene until authority finally arrived. What the Gothic century did was recognize the shape and amplify it. In this process, the case's uncertainties became opportunities. Ambiguity is fertile ground for myth. Where the archive is thin, invention can enter without resistance. Where the evidence is contested, the storyteller can choose whichever version best suits the emotional effect. The Bathory case, lacking a definitive public trial, lacking a clean legal transcript of guilt, offered precisely the kind of darkness that Gothic storytelling thrives on. The 18th century and the 19th century did not merely repeat the story. They edited it. They pulled forward the most vivid elements. They sharpened the cruelty. They pushed the Countess further from the realm of human wrongdoing and closer to the realm of monstrous appetite. They made the setting more theatrical. They introduced ritual where the record offered only allegation. They expanded numbers where the record offered uncertainty. They delivered moral clarity where the state had offered only containment. This is how Countess Dracula begins to form. The vampire myth, in particular, blossomed in the same era that began shaping Bathory into an immortal figure. This does not mean the Bathory legend caused vampire literature. It means that both were nourished by similar cultural needs. Europe's vampire tradition carried anxieties about disease, sexuality, death, and the fear that the dead might not remain properly contained. It also carried class tension. Vampires were often imagined as aristocratic, figures of privilege who live beyond ordinary human limits and feed upon the living. A noblewoman accused of harming young girls, protected by status, sealed away rather than publicly destroyed, becomes an obvious candidate for this motif. The image of a countess who steals youth also fits the 19th century preoccupation with purity. The era carried deep anxieties about female virtue, sexual danger, and the vulnerability of young women. Stories that centered on innocent girls endangered by powerful figures became moral narratives, warnings against predation and corruption. In such stories, the predator is rarely framed as merely criminal. The predator is framed as unnatural. That unnaturalness is what transforms a scandal into an archetype. In this sense, the vampire is not only a supernatural creature. It is a moral figure built to carry cultural fear. Gothic retellings of Bathory's story often shift the focus away from the messy mechanics of early modern justice and towards a more satisfying narrative, a beautiful and powerful woman whose vanity becomes her ruin, whose cruelty becomes ritual, whose hunger becomes immortal. The Countess becomes less a subject of contested history and more a character. And once she becomes a character, she becomes vulnerable to embellishment without limit. Her castle becomes darker in description than it needed to be in reality. Her household becomes a theater of blood. Her victims become nameless maidens in white. The state becomes either heroic or complicit, depending on the writer's taste. Even the nature of her confinement becomes more extreme in the telling, because Gothic tradition prefers to punish monsters in ways that feel mythic. The idea of a countess bricked into a room, fed through a slit, left to waste away in darkness functions like a fairy tale punishment. It is not merely a sentence. It is a symbolic sealing of evil. This is why the blood-bathing motif becomes so central. It turns violence into ritual. It turns cruelty into a perverse mirror of beauty culture. It offers a grotesque inversion of feminine self-maintenance. Instead of creams and herbs, blood. Instead of youth sustained by care, youth stolen by murder. It gives the story not only horror but an eroticized fascination, the idea of the beautiful aristocrat capable of brutality behind closed doors. It also ensures the story survives. A countess accused of violence might be remembered by historians. A countess who bathes in blood becomes a legend. The 19th century, especially, was skilled at this kind of transformation. It was an era of public trials and sensational newspapers, an era in which crime became entertainment and morality was performed through scandal. Even cases from earlier centuries were reshaped to fit these tastes. The public did not want ambiguity. It wanted villains. It wanted women who transgressed their expected softness to be punished in narrative form. It wanted cautionary tales dressed in Gothic costume. Bathory's story provided an aristocratic woman who could be made into a warning about vanity, about female power, about sexuality, about cruelty. It allowed society to channel its unease into one figure and call that figure a monster. This is also why the legend is so difficult to separate from the record. The legend does not merely sit on top of history, it changes how history is read. Once a person is culturally branded as Countess Dracula, readers return to the archival case looking for vampire proof. They treat every uncertain detail as confirmation. They treat every alleged cruelty as a step towards supernatural appetite. They forget that the original record was not written by Gothic authors. It was written by investigators and witnesses operating under political pressure. In other words, the Gothic century did not only tell the story. It trained the world how to see it. By the end of the 19th century, Elizabeth Bathory had become a fixed cultural object, the aristocratic female monster, the Blood Countess, a figure who could be invoked alongside other Gothic archetypes. She was no longer merely a Hungarian noblewoman accused of violence. She was a symbol of the idea that refinement can conceal predation, and that power can consume youth. Countess Dracula did not emerge from the 17th century archive hole. She emerged from centuries of repetition, embellishment, and cultural desire. The vampire was not proven. The vampire was written. And once written, it became difficult to erase. Chapter 23. Some legends endure because they are entertaining. Others endure because they perform a task. Elizabeth Bathory's story did not survive for centuries simply because it involved a castle and a countess and rumors of violence. It survived because it solved something for the people who told it. It gave shape to fears that were otherwise difficult to name, and it offered moral certainty where history had left ambiguity. It turned a complex case into a recognizable pattern: innocence threatened, power predatory, punishment demanded. In other words, it became useful. The first reason the legend stuck is the simplest: the setting and the social order were already Gothic. The castle is not merely architecture in this story. It is symbolism made stone. It stands above villages. It contains rooms hidden from public view. It belongs to an aristocratic world that was always partially separate from the lives of ordinary people. When a story of cruelty attaches itself to such a place, the imagination runs easily. A castle is the perfect container for secret harm because it suggests barriers, physical, social, and moral. It implies that something can happen inside and remain unseen, not because no one suspects, but because no one can intervene. That is the lived experience of class inequality rendered into architecture. The second reason the legend stuck is that it is a story about power, and power creates patterns that feel vampiric even without superstition. A noble household in early modern Europe did not merely employ servants. It consumed them. Servants gave labor, youth, health, and sometimes life. In return they received food, shelter, and wages that could vanish without warning. The household's comfort was built on bodies that did not belong to the household in name, but belonged to it in practice through dependency and hierarchy. The vampire myth expresses this relationship in its most literal form: the powerful feeding on the powerless. When later centuries imagined Bathory as someone who consumed the young, they were not inventing a fear from nothing. They were translating a social reality into a monstrous image. The Countess, in this reading, becomes the embodiment of aristocracy itself, refined on the surface, predatory beneath. This translation is one reason the vampire motif attaches so tightly. Vampires are often aristocratic because aristocracy already behaves, in many people's experience, as if it can take without consequence. The third reason the legend stuck is gender. The public imagination does not respond to male violence and female violence in the same way. A violent man can be placed into familiar categories: soldier, tyrant, criminal, brute. A violent woman, particularly an aristocratic woman, becomes something else. She is treated as unnatural. Her cruelty is interpreted not only as criminal, but as a violation of what women are supposed to be. The story becomes more charged because it involves transgression, a woman acting with authority over bodies, a woman inflicting harm rather than absorbing it, a woman who is not contained by expected softness. This is fertile ground for monstrosity. The witch, the temptress, the vampire countess, these figures are cultural mechanisms for dealing with female power that frightens. They turn a woman into a warning. They declare, this is what happens when femininity escapes control. Even if the original case involved real violence, later retellings frequently shaped that violence into something explicitly tied to feminine anxiety, vanity, aging, beauty. The blood-bathing motif is not merely cruelty, it is a story about the terror of a woman who refuses to age. It ties violence to beauty culture and frames the countess's alleged crimes as the ultimate expression of feminine obsession. That framing is culturally potent. It sticks because it offers a moral tale, the punishment of vanity, the ugliness beneath refinement, the danger of female desire unrestrained. The fourth reason the legend stuck is the nature of the state's resolution. The absence of a public trial created a vacuum. A story that ends in quiet confinement does not satisfy the human need for judgment. People want to hear the verdict spoken aloud. They want to see punishment delivered publicly. They want the world to acknowledge what happened. When the state refuses spectacle, folklore supplies it. The legend becomes the public trial that never occurred. This is why the story grew more extreme over time. The more unequal the resolution, the more the imagination demanded compensation. If servants were executed publicly while the countess was quietly contained, the imbalance invites mythic correction. In legend, she is not merely confined, she is entombed. She is bricked in. She is sealed like a demon. In legend, she does not merely die, she becomes immortal. In legend, she does not merely harm, she feeds. These are not random additions. They are narrative justice, a form of punishment created by story when law feels incomplete. The fifth reason the legend stuck is that it is a story about youth. Youth is a central vulnerability in nearly every culture. Stories that center on young girls in danger trigger protective fear and outrage. When a story suggests that youth is being stolen by a powerful figure, it becomes more than a crime narrative. It becomes an existential one. Aging is universal. Vulnerability is universal. The fear of exploitation is universal. The countess becomes a symbol of an ancient dread, that the young will be devoured by the old, that the innocent will be consumed by the powerful, that life itself can be taken and repurposed by those who already have too much. This is, at its core, the vampire story. In folklore, vampires steal blood, which is life. In the Bathory myth, the countess steals blood, which becomes youth. The symbolic equation is clear. It is not evidence, it is meaning. It turns the case into an allegory, and allegories endure longer than transcripts. The sixth reason the legend stuck is narrative economy. A complicated historical case does not travel easily. A clear, vivid image travels everywhere. She bathed in blood to stay young is a single sentence that can carry an entire story across centuries. It does not require the listener to understand Hungarian politics, aristocratic law, class structure, or the instability of testimony. It offers a simple moral horror that can be repeated at a table, in a pamphlet, in a book, in a film. Complexity dies. Symbols survive. Over time, the legend became self-reinforcing. The more it was repeated, the more it felt true. The more it felt true, the more it was repeated. The countess's name became a shorthand for aristocratic female monstrosity. Once a person becomes shorthand, they stop being treated as a historical individual and start being treated as a cultural object. This is why arguments about Bathory's guilt rarely settle the matter. Even if the case were proven beyond doubt one way or the other, the legend would remain because it is no longer dependent on evidence. It is dependent on what it expresses: fear of power, fear of predation, fear of female authority, fear of youth consumed, fear of injustice unresolved. The legend stuck because it functions. It offers society a monster it already recognizes, an aristocrat who feeds. It offers a setting that already feels haunted, a castle above the village. It offers a punishment that feels mythically correct, confinement that resembles entombment. And it offers an image that is impossible to forget: blood turned into beauty. History did not need to prove the vampire for the vampire to take hold. It needed only to leave enough darkness for one to thrive. Chapter 24. The strongest stories are rarely the most accurate ones. They are the ones that feel complete. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory endures because it offers completion: a countess who becomes a monster, a castle that becomes a lair, a series of victims that becomes a feast, a punishment that becomes a sealing away. It is a narrative that satisfies the imagination. The historical record is less satisfying, and therefore more important. To approach this case responsibly, the question is not what people most like to believe. The question is what the surviving evidence can actually support. That support has limits. It also has strengths. The Bathory case is not pure myth. It is rooted in a documented legal process, and that process left traces that can be examined. What can be proven is not the most sensational version of the story. It is the framework within which the sensational version was later built. Elizabeth Bathory was a real historical person, a Hungarian noblewoman of significant status, connected to powerful families, controlling substantial estates. This is foundational and uncontested. Her rank mattered, not as background color, but as a central force shaping the entire case. Her social position influenced how she was treated, how accusations were managed, and how punishment was ultimately delivered. A formal investigation was conducted under royal authority. This is likewise solid. The case did not remain only a local rumor, it became an official matter. Testimony was gathered. Statements were recorded. Names were entered into the kind of documentation that survives precisely because it served the Crown's administrative purposes. The involvement of Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, signals the seriousness of the matter within the state's own logic. A man of that position did not move on village gossip alone. Elizabeth Bathory was arrested in late 1610 and placed under some form of custody and confinement. Whatever the precise conditions were in detail, the essential outcome is clear: she was removed from active control, deprived of freedom, and held until her death. She did not return to public life. She did not regain her estates in the way she previously managed them. The state's intervention broke her authority. Several servants connected to her household were tried in early 1611 and executed. This is one of the case's most significant anchors because it is not a later legend but a demonstrable legal outcome. Executions are not the kind of detail that can be dismissed as mere folklore. The state punished members of her household severely, and those punishments indicate that the court considered the crime substantial. Bathory herself did not face a public trial. This is also demonstrable through what is absent as much as what is present. The case was resolved through confinement rather than open judicial spectacle. Whether this choice was driven by noble privilege, political strategy, concerns about evidence, or some mixture, the fact remains: the state chose containment over public adjudication. Elizabeth Bathory died in custody in 1614. This is part of the record, and it marks the end of what can be discussed as her documented life. These points form the backbone of what can be proven. But readers often want more than a backbone. They want flesh, details of what happened inside the household, the nature of the alleged violence, the scale of victimization, and the meaning of the servant trials. This is where the record becomes both compelling and unstable. The testimony gathered during the investigation does support the claim that contemporaries believed serious harm occurred within the Bathory household. The existence of numerous statements alleging cruelty is not, by itself, proof of each alleged act. It is proof that the allegations were substantial enough to be formally recorded and treated seriously by authorities. The repeated themes in testimony, injuries, punishment, fear, deaths, create a pattern that makes the basic proposition plausible, that the household was associated with real violence, not merely with gossip. What can be proven, then, is not the full detail of every alleged event, but the presence of a case strong enough to justify arrest, confinement, and executions. This is a crucial distinction. The record can establish that a scandal of significant magnitude existed. It can establish that the state acted decisively. It can establish that servants were convicted of severe wrongdoing connected to the household. It can establish that Bathory was removed from power and kept under restraint until death. It cannot, with equal firmness, establish the most famous elements of the myth. The blood-bathing story does not belong to the most reliable early record. It appears in later tradition. The image of Elizabeth Bathory bathing in blood to preserve youth is not something that can be treated as proven historical fact in a truth-first manuscript. It belongs to the story's later evolution, not its legal foundation. Similarly, the vampire framing, immortality, supernatural hunger, deliberate ritual in the folkloric sense, does not appear in the record as demonstrable reality. The archive does not contain the supernatural. It contains human violence, alleged and punished within the language of law and politics. This chapter, then, does not deliver a dramatic verdict. It does something less exciting and more honest. It marks the limits of certainty. The Bathory story can be anchored in proven facts. A noblewoman existed, held real power, and controlled estates and servants. Rumors of severe harm became substantial enough to draw state interest. An official investigation collected many statements. The Palatine intervened. Bathory was arrested and confined. Servants were tried and executed. Bathory was not publicly tried. She died in confinement in 1614. Within those proven facts, there is room for interpretation, debate, and careful analysis of testimony. There is also room for acknowledging what the record cannot settle. A truth-first manuscript does not need to promise more than the archive can give. In fact, its credibility depends on refusing that promise. Because the most unsettling truth in this case is not a supernatural one. It is that a story of alleged cruelty could be serious enough to provoke state action, and still be resolved without full public clarity. It is that justice could be performed unevenly, and the record could still survive as both evidence and uncertainty. It is that a woman could be removed from power, and the world could still argue, centuries later, over what exactly she did. The legend thrives in the space between those facts. But the facts remain, and they are grim enough on their own. Chapter 25. The most dangerous thing a true crime narrative can do is mistake repetition for certainty. Elizabeth Bathory's story has been repeated for centuries. It has been retold, translated, sensationalized, moralist, and reshaped into forms that suit the tastes of each era. In that repetition, certain details have become so familiar that they feel factual simply because they are widely known. But familiarity is not evidence. In cases like this, familiarity is often the product of legend. The historical record does not fail because it is incomplete. It fails rather because it is human, formed by testimony under pressure, filtered through politics, and shaped by a justice system that did not operate according to modern standards. The archive can support certain conclusions. It cannot support all the conclusions people want. This chapter marks the boundaries. The first and most persistent boundary concerns victim numbers. Many popular accounts attach extraordinary numbers to the Bathory story, sometimes describing hundreds of victims. These figures are powerful because they transform the Countess from a violent noblewoman into something almost mythic, a force of devastation too vast to be merely human. But victim counts of that scale are among the least secure elements of the case. The surviving record does not allow modern certainty about the exact number of deaths. Testimony can describe patterns and alleged incidents, but it does not produce a neat ledger of victims. Names are often missing. Dates are often vague. Some statements are indirect. Some are hearsay. In an era where poor girls were rarely documented carefully, even genuine deaths could vanish from official trace. As a result, the archive cannot confirm the dramatic victim numbers that later tradition prefers. It can suggest that harm occurred and that it was serious. It cannot, with integrity, offer a definitive tally that satisfies the most sensational versions of the legend. The second boundary concerns the most famous detail of all, bloodbathing. The image of Elizabeth Bathory bathing in blood to preserve her youth is cultural shorthand for the entire case. It is what has turned her into Countess Dracula in popular imagination. But this motif is not reliably established in the earliest surviving material. It is a later narrative development that emerges more clearly in posthumous retellings than in the core 17th century investigative framework. This does not mean no blood was ever present. It means the specific ritualized claim, blood used deliberately as a cosmetic sacrament of youth, cannot be treated as proven history. A truth-first manuscript can discuss the blood-bathing story as legend, explore when it appears, and analyze why it stuck. It cannot responsibly present it as documented fact of the original case. The third boundary concerns the arrest scene itself. Many retellings describe a dramatic intervention, officials storming the castle and finding victims immediately, discovering bodies or injured girls in the act, catching the Countess in a moment so unmistakable that doubt collapses. These stories may reflect later elaborations drawn from the atmosphere of testimony and from the human desire for decisive revelation. They may also contain traces of truth. But the record does not offer enough stable contemporary support to narrate every dramatic element as fact. What can be proven is that intervention occurred and that Bathory was arrested in late 1610. What cannot be proven with equal certainty is the precise theatrical scene later culture expects, the perfect moment of discovery that resolves all ambiguity in a single night. The fourth boundary concerns the motives of the state. The Bathory case sits at an intersection where politics and violence could coexist. The Crown had interests: stability, control of scandal, management of noble privilege, and the ever-present significance of land and debt. These factors do not negate the possibility of genuine crime. They do, however, prevent the case from being treated as purely moral and purely straightforward. What cannot be proven conclusively is the degree to which political motives shaped the timing, intensity, and resolution of the investigation. It is possible that real violence drove intervention. It is also possible that political advantage helped determine how and when that violence was acted upon. The archive allows for both readings. It does not allow a simple singular motive to be declared with certainty. The fifth boundary concerns the reliability of testimony. Testimony is the backbone of the case, and it is also its most fragile material. Witnesses spoke under conditions shaped by fear, hierarchy, and the demands of investigators. Some accounts were direct. Many were indirect. Some statements were likely influenced by community rumor. Some may have been shaped by what witnesses believed the state wished to hear. The early modern legal environment did not guarantee the kind of voluntary, carefully protected witness process modern readers assume. This does not make testimony worthless. It makes it complicated. What cannot be proven, therefore, is that every allegation in testimony occurred exactly as described. The record supports the existence of serious allegations and patterns of fear. It does not support the assumption that each detail is equally factual, equally witnessed, and equally reliable. The sixth boundary concerns the interior life of the household. A great house can be documented in its structure, its estates, its servants, its governance. But the intimate mechanics of harm, who ordered what, who carried it out, who resisted, who complied, who was coerced, rarely survive in clean form. Even in modern cases, the private dynamics of abusive systems are difficult to reconstruct. In early modern cases, they are even harder. Servants were vulnerable. Records were selective. Fear shaped speech. What cannot be proven is the full chain of responsibility in a way that would satisfy modern standards. The servant trials suggest wrongdoing within the household. They do not necessarily reveal every dimension of how that wrongdoing was organized. The seventh boundary concerns Elizabeth Bathory's own definitive guilt for every claimed act. This is the most sensitive boundary, and it cannot be handled with careless certainty. The state acted against her. That action is meaningful. The state confined her until death. That is meaningful. Servants were executed. That is meaningful. Together, these facts support the conclusion that authorities believed serious crimes were connected to her household. But belief, even state belief, is not identical to modern proof. The absence of a public trial leaves the case without a definitive courtroom conclusion that satisfies present-day evidentiary standards. This does not vindicate her. It does not condemn her with absolute closure. It leaves the case in its true form, historically significant, grim, and unresolved in the way many cases shaped by power are unresolved. The final boundary concerns the supernatural. The archive does not prove vampirism. It does not prove immortality. It does not prove ritual blood consumption as a magical act. It preserves a human story, one that later centuries transformed into a vampire tale. The vampire belongs to the cultural afterlife, not to the historical record. Any suggestion that Bathory was literally a vampire must remain outside the realm of proof and inside the realm of belief, metaphor, or conjecture. This does not diminish the story. In many ways, it strengthens it. Because the most unsettling truth of the Bathory case is not that the supernatural might have been real. It is that a story of alleged extreme harm could exist within a powerful household, become serious enough to provoke state action, and still leave behind an archive that cannot satisfy the modern hunger for certainty. The record gives structure: investigation, arrest, servant trials, confinement, death. The legend gives completion: bloodbaths, endless victims, a vampire countess. The truth lives between them, and that space is not empty. It is crowded with fear, power, silence, and the human need to make meaning where justice did not deliver clarity. In this case, what cannot be proven is as important as what can, because it reveals exactly why the legend was able to grow so large. The archive left room. And in that room, the vampire was born. Chapter 26. There are some stories the world does not allow to remain human. Elizabeth Bathory's case is one of them. The historical record offers a woman of immense status, a household accused of severe harm, an investigation led under royal authority, servant trials that ended in execution, and a noblewoman removed from power and confined until death. These are grim facts. They do not require embellishment to be disturbing. Yet the story did not remain within those boundaries. It grew teeth. Over time, the Countess became Countess Dracula. This transformation was not the result of a hidden document proving the supernatural. It was the result of a cultural process, the world's habit of turning certain kinds of violence into myth because myth is easier to carry than complexity. A record filled with testimony, politics, uncertainty, and uneven justice does not travel as well as a single vivid image of blood and youth. The archive offers no clean verdict. The legend offers one. When people are given an ambiguous ending, they often write their own conclusion. In the case of Bathory, the conclusion the world wrote was vampiric. The vampire is not a fact of the record. It is a fact of the story's afterlife. The key distinction is not whether Elizabeth Bathory drank blood or bore fangs. Those elements belong to folklore. The key distinction is that the vampire figure expresses something real about the way her story was experienced and remembered. It names a fear that cannot always be spoken plainly, that power can consume, that the privileged can feed on the lives of the vulnerable, that the strongest people may remain protected even when the weakest suffer. In this sense, Countess Dracula is not a creature. She is an interpretation. She is the cultural shape given to a case that combined aristocratic authority, alleged cruelty, and a state response designed to contain scandal rather than provide public clarity. The vampire myth thrives precisely where the record fails to satisfy. It thrives because it offers moral certainty. It turns an administrative solution into a symbolic punishment, the monster sealed behind stone, the predator removed from the living world. It turns noble privilege into supernatural predation, making visible what the social order often kept hidden. This is why the vampire motif clings so tightly. It is not only a story about brutality. It is a story about exploitation. A vampire does not kill in a single moment. A vampire feeds. It drains gradually. It takes life in a way that leaves the victim pale, diminished, and discarded. This is the emotional shape of many relationships between the powerful and the powerless. The myth simply makes the metaphor literal. It also offers a way to process the gendered anxiety at the center of Bathory's legend. A violent man can be placed in familiar categories. A violent noblewoman is more unsettling because she violates expectation. Folklore responds by pushing her out of humanity entirely. It makes her witch, demon, monster, vampire. In doing so, society both condemns her and protects its own assumptions. The problem is not the system, the story suggests. The problem is the unnatural woman within it. This is one of the hidden functions of the vampire legend. It individualizes what may be structural. If the Countess is a vampire, then the horror is contained in her body, her appetite, her evil. If the Countess is human, then the horror stretches further, into the social system that made servants disposable, into the legal structure that allowed noble privilege to reshape justice, into the political calculus that chose confinement over public trial. The vampire offers a simpler answer, and simplicity is seductive. Yet even as the vampire myth distances the horror from the social order, it also reveals something truthful about how people felt. A household accused of repeated harm, a castle that seemed to swallow girls, a noblewoman who remained protected by rank. These realities create a sensation that can feel supernatural even when it is not. When violence is hidden, it begins to resemble a haunting. When power is unaccountable, it begins to resemble a curse. When the young disappear and the old remain secure, it begins to resemble a predatory law of nature. Folklore calls that law a vampire. This manuscript has traced two lives of the same story. The first life belongs to history, a case gathered into testimony, acted upon by the state, resolved through servant trials and the confinement of a noblewoman. It is an incomplete record, but it is real. The second life belongs to culture, the story reshaped into ritual, numbers inflated into myth, blood turned into beauty, confinement turned into entombment, and Elizabeth Bathory turned into Countess Dracula. Both lives matter, but they must not be confused. History cannot confirm the vampire. History can explain why the vampire arrived. It arrived because the story needed a monster large enough to hold what the record could not settle. It arrived because the absence of a public trial left space for moral imagination to write its own verdict. It arrived because aristocratic cruelty is easier to believe when it is made supernatural. It arrived because the world has always been fascinated by the idea that youth can be stolen, not only by violence, but by power. Whether Elizabeth Bathory was guilty of the most extreme allegations is a question the archive will never answer to modern satisfaction. The state acted decisively, but it acted in a way designed to protect itself and its noble order. Servants paid with their lives. The Countess paid with her freedom. The victims, as individuals, remain largely unnamed. This is the bleak truth beneath the legend. A story of suffering was absorbed into political management. A woman was removed without full public clarity. The world filled the gaps with images of blood and immortality because immortality is easier to imagine than ambiguity, and blood is easier to remember than bureaucracy. Countess Dracula remains one of Europe's most enduring figures not because she is proven to have been a vampire, but because the vampire is the perfect cultural expression of what the story suggests, that power can become predatory, that cruelty can hide behind refinement, and that justice can be shaped by class. The legend may never disappear. It is too useful, too vivid, too perfectly made for the dark. But the record remains, and the record deserves to be treated with respect. It does not offer certainty. It offers a warning that behind stone walls, in any era, harm can flourish when power is allowed to feed without consequence. And that when history refuses to provide a clean ending, the shadow